Why did the Roswell incident quickly shift from a flying disc recovery to an official weather balloon explanation? It was a calm night sky, moonless and deep, when something unusual flickered high above the darkened fields. For a moment, a silent glow danced among the stars, moving in a way that no shooting star or plane should move. Such mysteries in the heavens have whispered to humanity for centuries. Long before radar screens and rocket ships, people spoke in hushed tones about strange lights that appeared briefly and vanished without a trace. In ancient times, they might have been seen as omens or wandering spirits. But as the world entered the era of flight and war, these ethereal shadows in the sky began to be documented with growing intrigue. During the turmoil of the Second World War, something extraordinary was reported by military pilots on both sides of the conflict. On many late nights, Allied airmen flying missions over Europe would return with bewildering tales. They described glowing orbs of light that flew alongside their aircraft, pacing them through the darkness. Imagine a lone bomber droning high above the clouds, its crew suddenly noticing a cluster of orange lights tailing their plane. The lights didn't attack or communicate. They simply danced and swerved in formation, as if observing. These perplexing phenomena came to be known as Foo Fighters by the pilots, a whimsical name for a truly puzzling encounter. Both Allied and Axis pilots witnessed these ghostly lights. At first, each side suspected the other had developed a new secret weapon prowling the night skies. But no aircraft of that era could perform the acrobatics these glowing spheres seemed to manage. No wreckage or solid evidence was ever recovered to give a clue to their origin. Military intelligence units were left baffled. Brief reports were filed and whispered about, then classified or tucked away. The war ended without answers to what the Foo Fighters really were. Peace returned to the world, but it did not put a stop to the unusual lights that had haunted the skies. In the summer of 1946, mere months after World War II, a new wave of aerial mysteries erupted across the northern skies of Europe. Night after night, residents and military observers in Sweden and Finland began spotting what they described as ghost rockets streaking overhead. These objects looked like rockets or missiles, slender, fast-moving, sometimes leaving faint glowing trails. Yet they appeared in surprising numbers and patterns. Over 1,000 sightings were reported that year. Swedish defense forces, alarmed by the possibility that these might be secret Soviet test weapons or some unknown threat, combed the countryside for any physical evidence of crashes. A few craters found in remote lakes were suspected to be ghost rocket impact sites. But when divers and investigators examined them, nothing concrete was recovered. The ghost rockets, like the Foo Fighters before them, left far more questions than answers. Observers noted how some of these mystery rockets appeared to change course in mid-flight, or even slow down, behaviors inexplicable for ordinary missiles of the time. Reports came in not just from Scandinavia, but from other parts of Europe as well, suggesting a phenomenon with broad reach. For the public and officials alike, it was becoming clear that something unknown was moving through the skies, something that wasn't following the conventional rules of airplanes or natural celestial events. Whatever these ghostly visitors were, they only deepened the intrigue and concern about the skies above. These early encounters set the stage for what was to come. Humanity was on the brink of the modern era of UFOs, unidentified flying objects, though that famous term hadn't been coined just yet. People around the world were growing more aware of the vast, starry expanse above, and the possibility that it held secrets yet to be discovered. There was a tingling mix of curiosity and apprehension. If strange craft or lights could roam the skies with impunity, what did that mean for our understanding of technology, security, or even the existence of life beyond Earth? By the late 1940s, the faint glows of wartime mystery lights had largely faded. But an even greater mystery was waiting just over the horizon. In a world adjusting to peace and consumed by the tasks of rebuilding, few were prepared for the sudden explosion of sightings that would soon captivate the public's imagination. Then, one sunny afternoon in 1947, over the lush green mountains of the American Pacific Northwest, an event occurred that would change everything. It would thrust the phenomenon of flying saucers into the spotlight and mark the true beginning of the UFO era. One bright June afternoon in 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying his small plane past the towering peaks of Washington State's Cascade Mountains. The air was clear, and the sun gleamed off Mount Rainier's snowy summit as Arnold scanned the horizon. He was on the lookout for a missing military plane rumoured to have gone down in the area. Instead, something entirely unexpected caught his eye. A sudden flash, like sunlight glinting off a mirror, streaked by. Startled, Arnold steadied his plane and peered in that direction. To his astonishment, he saw a formation of strange objects in the distance, flying in an unwavering line. There were 9 of them, he would later report, shining bright, with a blue-white hue as they moved. They appeared disc-like or crescent-shaped, and they were travelling incredibly fast, far faster than any jet Arnold knew of in 1947. He later estimated their speed might have been over 1,000 miles per hour, which was unheard of. As he watched in amazement, he noted how they flew in a kind of diagonal chain, and how they darted erratically, at times skipping in altitude. He described their motion vividly, like a saucer if you skipped it across water. This poetic description, meant to convey their unusual movement, would inadvertently give the world a new phrase. When Arnold eventually landed and told his story, newspapers mistakenly reported that he had seen flying saucers, assuming he meant the objects were shaped like saucers rather than describing their motion. Thus, the term flying saucer was born, capturing the public's imagination overnight. Arnold's account of 9 mysterious flying discs over Mount Rainier made headlines around the country. He was an experienced and respected pilot, not prone to exaggeration. Many believed he had truly seen something out of the ordinary. His story opened the floodgates. In the weeks and months that followed, hundreds of people across America came forward with their own reports of strange objects in the sky. It was as if Arnold's report had given others permission to share experiences they'd hesitated to mention before. That summer of 1947, flying saucer fever gripped the nation. Almost daily, newspapers carried stories of odd lights, saucer-shaped craft, or metallic discs zipping through the skies from coast to coast. Some sightings were undoubtedly mistakes or hoaxes, but many came from ordinary people who seemed sincerely bewildered by what they saw. Just when it seemed the stories could not get any stranger, early July brought an even more sensational claim. In a quiet desert region of New Mexico, something apparently crashed on a remote ranch outside the town of Roswell. A rancher named Mac Brazel rode out one morning to check his sheep after a fierce nighttime storm, and he discovered a field strewn with peculiar debris. Shiny scraps of material unlike anything he'd seen, thin, foil-like sheets that sprang back to shape when crumpled, and lightweight wooden-looking beams with odd symbols on them were scattered across the scrubland. Brazel was baffled. The sheep refused to cross the debris field, acting skittish. Not sure what to do, he gathered up some of the strangest pieces and went into Roswell to show them to the sheriff. The sheriff in turn notified officials at the nearby Army airfield. Then, on July 8, 1947, came a startling official announcement. The US Army Air Force, as the Air Force was still known at the time, stated that they had recovered a flying disc from that ranch. The local Roswell newspaper's front page blared that the Army had a flying saucer in its possession. The world was astonished. Could this be the proof of extraterrestrial visitors that so many had imagined? However, almost as quickly as the news had broken, the army reversed its story. Within a day, higher authorities insisted that it was all a misunderstanding. The wreckage was simply a downed weather balloon, not a spacecraft. A new set of photographs was released to the press, showing an officer with what looked like pieces of a torn weather balloon, flimsy aluminum foil, rubber strips, and balsa wood sticks. The message was clear. Nothing otherworldly had crash-landed in the desert after all. The flying saucer was officially nothing more than misidentified debris. The Roswell incident, as it came to be known, faded from the spotlight as quickly as it had appeared. Most Americans accepted the weather balloon explanation and moved on. A few people, however, quietly wondered if there was more to the Roswell story. Some of the military men involved whispered that the strange debris hadn't really looked like any weather balloon they'd ever seen. But in the charged atmosphere of the late 1940s, with Cold War secrecy intensifying, few dared question the official line out loud. And so, the incident was largely forgotten by the public in the decades that followed. Still, in hindsight, Roswell and Kenneth Arnold's sighting together had planted a seed of mystery. The notion that unknown objects might truly be roaming our skies was now firmly in the minds of many, even if it would lie dormant for a time. Faced with the wave of sightings that spread across 1947 and 1948, the United States military began to take the UFO phenomenon more seriously, albeit behind closed doors. While publicly officials urged calm and often dismissed reports as mistaken identities or nerves, the US Air Force quietly set up a task force to investigate more rigorously. In early 1948, this effort was formalized as Project Sign, the first official study of the flying saucer mystery. A group of Air Force intelligence officers, along with some scientists, was assigned to collect and analyze UFO reports from around the country. They gathered pilot testimonies, radar readings, photographs, any hard data they could find that might explain the rash of strange sightings. From the start, sharp debates erupted within Project Sign about what these phenomena could be. Some on the team firmly suspected that a hidden foreign adversary, perhaps the Soviet Union, had developed advanced aircraft or missiles accounting for the sightings. After all, the Cold War had begun, and the Soviets had just entered the atomic age. Could they also have leapfrogged aviation technology in secret? Others in the group, however, were drawn to a more startling hypothesis. Maybe, just maybe, the objects weren't from any nation on Earth. The extraterrestrial theory, that the disks and lights might be visitors from another world, was whispered about, though not loudly. It was a bold idea, and in 1948 it felt almost fantastical. Yet the investigators of Project Sign couldn't entirely rule it out, especially not after some of the baffling cases they examined. As 1948 went on, cases continued to pour in, and a few defied easy explanation. In July of that year, 2 experienced commercial pilots flying a DC-3 airliner over Alabama had a harrowing encounter. Late at night, at high altitude, they suddenly saw a long, cylindrical object streak directly toward their plane. The object flashed by, just missing them. Both pilots got a clear look. It appeared metallic, torpedo-shaped, and even seemed to have rows of lighted windows along its side. In a split second, it was gone, shooting off into the distance at a tremendous speed. The pilots were left shaken, convinced they had nearly collided with something not of any conventional make. Another dramatic incident occurred in October 1948, when a young Air National Guard fighter pilot named George Gorman engaged in a nighttime dogfight of sorts over Fargo, North Dakota. Gorman had been flying a solo training mission in his F-51 Mustang fighter. As he circled above the dark town, he noticed a single bright light in the sky that wasn't on any flight plan. He radioed the control tower, and they confirmed they also saw the mysterious light. Gorman decided to pursue it. What followed was a surreal aerial duel. Every time Gorman tried to close in on the light, it would turn sharply or speed away in sudden bursts. The object seemed to be toying with him. At one point, the light streaked straight at Gorman's plane, forcing him to swerve. It then shot upward, and Gorman gave chase until his plane nearly stalled from the altitude. Finally, the glowing object broke away and vanished into the starry sky. When Gorman landed, he was shaken and astonished. He had never seen an aircraft or any physical object move like that. Such accounts from well-trained airmen made a deep impression on Project Sign's investigators. These were not crackpots or fantasists, but sober professionals describing something truly extraordinary in the skies. By the end of 1948, the team at Project Sign was growing frustrated by the lack of concrete answers. According to later recollections, they prepared a top-secret report for the Air Force Chief of Staff, intended to sum up what they'd learned. This report, often referred to later as the estimate of the situation, supposedly concluded that no known human technology could account for the most perplexing UFO reports, and that the best explanation was an extraterrestrial one. When this bold assessment reached Air Force headquarters, it was not welcomed. The story goes that Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg flatly refused to accept the conclusion that alien spacecraft were behind the sightings. The evidence, in his view, was too flimsy to support such an outlandish claim. Allegedly, he ordered the report scrapped. Word filtered back to the Project Sign team that interplanetary theories were off the table. Whether or not the details of this tale are exactly true, one thing is certain. By early 1949, the Air Force's approach to UFOs had shifted toward greater skepticism. In early 1949, Project Sign was shut down and immediately succeeded by a new effort, Project Grudge. The very name Grudge reflected the prevailing attitude. It was as if the Air Force held a grudge against the pesky UFO topic and intended to put it to rest. Project Grudge's mission was straightforward: explain away the UFO reports and reassure the public there was nothing mysterious going on. Over the course of 1949 and 1950, Grudge investigators did debunk many UFO sightings. A number of cases were traced to weather balloons, aircraft, bright stars, or other ordinary things. Some instances were indeed hoaxes or misidentifications. The Air Force made sure to publicize these explanations, reinforcing the narrative that Americans had been spooked by misperceptions and imaginative rumors. Still, not every report was so easily solved. A few well-documented cases remained in Project Grudge's files marked as unidentified. These were largely kept quiet. By mid-1950, with fewer sensational news stories and with officialdom constantly emphasizing conventional explanations, the public's UFO excitement had largely died down. Yet the mystery itself had not gone away. In the summer of 1951, a new series of strange sightings reminded everyone that the phenomenon was still very much alive. In late August of that year, residents of Lubbock, Texas, including science professors from Texas Technological College, repeatedly observed groups of glowing objects flying overhead at night. The objects were described as bluish-white lights traveling high and fast in semicircular arrangements. On one occasion, around 9 p.m., about 20 of these lights passed silently above Lubbock in a loose formation. The sightings continued for weeks. Seeking an explanation, one Texas Tech freshman kept his camera ready, and one night he managed to snap several photos of the lights. The grainy photographs, when published, showed a cluster of faint, disc-like lights arcing through the sky. The Lubbock lights, as they quickly became known, garnered national attention and sparked fierce debate. Project Grudge investigators descended on Lubbock to look into the case. After careful study, the Air Force came up with a possible explanation. They suggested that the witnesses might have actually been seeing a flock of plover birds reflecting the city's new streetlights as they flew overhead. The rounded formation of the lights could indeed resemble birds flying in a V shape, and plovers are known to have white undersides that could catch the light. It was a creative hypothesis that offered a natural explanation for a seemingly unnatural sight. Some people accepted this, or at least found it plausible, but many others did not. The local professors pointed out that the lights moved too fast and too high for low-flying birds, and there was no sound of geese or ducks honking. To them, the bird theory felt like a stretch. In the end, the Lubbock Lights case remained unresolved in the eyes of many, an unsolved puzzle behind the veneer of an official explanation. By 1952, UFO reports were again surging. Sightings were coming in not only from everyday citizens, but also from pilots, military personnel, and law enforcement, both in the United States and abroad. It was clear that the phenomenon was not going away, and the fragmented approach of Project Grudge was insufficient to handle the volume and complexity of the reports. So, in the spring of 1952, the Air Force revamped its investigative effort once more. Project Grudge was dissolved and replaced with a new, better-resourced program, Project Blue Book. This initiative aimed to take a more rigorous, scientific look at the UFO issue. Every sighting would be catalogued systematically, and the goal was to resolve the mystery once and for all, or at least to determine if these unknown objects posed any threat. Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, a respected World War II veteran, was put in charge of Blue Book. Ruppelt approached the task with an open mind and a methodical attitude. He famously introduced the term unidentified flying object, UFO, as a more general and neutral label than flying saucer. Under his leadership, the Air Force investigators tried to standardize their methods. They issued detailed questionnaires for witnesses, catalogued reports on index cards, and sought explanations ranging from the astronomical to the psychological. They also consulted with experts like Dr. J. Allen Hynek, an astronomer who had initially been a skeptic, but was developing a keen interest in the phenomenon. By the summer of 1952, Project Blue Book was up and running and bracing itself for what would turn out to be a very busy time. And indeed, that summer would become one of the most significant in UFO history. Unbeknownst to Ruppelt and his team, events were about to unfold that would push the UFO question to new heights. Strange objects were soon to appear in unprecedented places, even in the skies above the nation's capital, challenging Blue Book's resources and resolve. The era of Project Blue Book had truly begun, and with it, a new intensity in the quest to understand the enigma of the unknown objects in the skies. Our journey now continues into those pivotal Blue Book years, a time of intense UFO scrutiny and some of the most famous cases on record. In the summer of 1952, the newly formed Project Blue Book faced its first major trial by fire. Throughout that July, a series of dramatic UFO encounters unfolded in the skies above the nation's capital. Late on a humid Saturday night, air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport stared in disbelief at their radar screens. Dozens of bright blips were appearing where no known planes should be. The mysterious targets moved fast, at times darting across 30 miles of radar range in mere seconds, and they clustered alarmingly close to restricted airspace over the White House and Capitol building. Controllers double-checked their equipment and confirmed the contacts were real. They contacted Andrews Air Force Base, which reported its own radar picking up the unknown objects. Soon, visual sightings poured in. Airline pilots on approach reported seeing strange glowing orbs streaking past, and residents on the ground spotted discs whizzing high over Washington, D.C. By midnight, Air Force jet fighters were scrambled from a nearby base. Screaming into the night sky, the pilots attempted to intercept the intruders. But each time a jet closed in, the UFOs would accelerate beyond reach or simply vanish from the scope. One pilot radioed that he saw bright lights dancing around him before they zoomed away into the stars. Frustrated and baffled, the Air Force pilots eventually returned to base with no clear answers. In the radar rooms, the unknown blips finally disappeared in the early hours of the morning. That incredible night was just the beginning. The unexplained aerial invasion over Washington repeated itself 1 week later, in the very same way. Unidentified flying objects swarming in the midnight skies, effortlessly outmaneuvering Air Force jets. The press caught wind of these events, and sensational headlines splashed across newspapers worldwide. Flying saucers over Washington? Public excitement and anxiety surged. Never before had UFOs shown up with such brazenness right over the seat of government. Demand for an explanation grew fervent. Project Blue Book's staff, inundated with reports and queries, found themselves under tremendous pressure to solve the mystery. The Air Force, not eager to admit bafflement, hastily organized the largest press conference since World War II. In a packed briefing room at the Pentagon, a high-ranking Air Force general calmly assured reporters that there was no evidence of visitors from outer space. He attributed the radar sightings to a temperature inversion, a weather condition that can cause false radar blips, and suggested that the visual sightings were misidentified stars or meteors amplified by excited imaginations. Many in the scientific community accepted this explanation, at least officially. But behind closed doors, even some Blue Book investigators had their doubts that weather alone could account for the vivid reports from trained radar operators and pilots. The Washington incidents marked a turning point. In response to the hubbub, the Air Force convened a special panel of scientists in early 1953, led by physicist Howard Robertson, to review the UFO situation. After a few days of quick study, the Robertson panel recommended that UFOs be downplayed in the media and that the Air Force focus on debunking sightings to calm public fear. Project Blue Book, still under Captain Ruppelt's leadership at that time, dutifully took a more low-key approach in the wake of that guidance. Ruppelt himself, however, was privately not entirely satisfied. He had seen enough high-quality cases to suspect that something more than mass hysteria or misidentification was at work in a small percentage of UFO reports. Under Ruppelt, Blue Book investigated case after case during the early 1950s. By the end of 1952, the project had catalogued hundreds of incidents. Most did turn out to have conventional explanations: aircraft, stars, weather balloons, atmospheric quirks. But a stubborn residue of cases remained puzzling. One striking example occurred in central France in the summer of 1954, when a former Air Force pilot and several villagers observed a metallic disc hovering silently above a farm field at dusk. The object suddenly shot skyward at incredible speed when a military jet approached. Blue Book obtained reports on this case from French authorities and filed it as unexplained. It was becoming clear that UFO sightings were a global phenomenon, not just an American peculiarity. By 1955, Captain Ruppelt had left Project Blue Book, and the Air Force assigned new personnel who were generally more skeptical. The project's tone shifted. The mandate now was to explain cases whenever possible and minimize the attention given to those that couldn't be explained. Still, intriguing reports continued to come in. In November 1957, for instance, patrol officers in Levelland, Texas, experienced something extraordinary. Over the course of one night, nearly a dozen motorists in and around town reported a glowing oval object that approached their vehicles and seemingly caused their engines to stall and headlights to dim. One shaken driver described the object as a bright bluish-green electric flash that filled the sky and abruptly went out, after which his truck engine mysteriously died. Moments later, as the light receded, his engine came back to life on its own. The local police initially thought the calls were a prank, until their own radios acted up and they witnessed a streaking light themselves. Project Blue Book dispatched an investigator to Levelland. In the end, the official conclusion chalked the incident up to an electrical storm and ball lightning, phenomena that could theoretically cause static interference with engines, even though witnesses swore the weather was clear that night. To many, the Blue Book explanation sounded far-fetched, but it served to quell public nerves. Quietly, within Blue Book's files, the Levelland case was noted as unresolved. Amid the hundreds of routine misidentifications, there were a few cases that deeply intrigued even Blue Book's analysts. One occurred in April 1964 on the outskirts of Socorro, New Mexico. Police officer Lonnie Zamora was chasing a speeding car along a lonely stretch of desert highway when he was startled by a loud roar and a flame in the sky to the southwest. Thinking a nearby dynamite shack might have blown up, Zamora abandoned the chase and rushed to investigate the blaze. As he crested a hill, he came upon a bewildering sight in the arroyo below. A shining white, oval-shaped craft, about the size of a car, was sitting on the ground on spindly legs. Two small humanoid figures stood outside the object, one of whom seemed startled and jumped slightly when Zamora's police cruiser came into view. For a moment, Zamora watched from a distance of perhaps 150 yards, utterly astonished. Suddenly, the oval craft began to hiss and roar. A blue-orange flame shot out from its underside, and the object slowly rose into the air. Fearing it might explode, Zamora hit the dirt, but the craft simply ascended silently into the sky and then sped off into the distance with a high-pitched whirring sound. When he gathered his wits, Officer Zamora found that the strange vehicle had left physical traces behind. The ground at the landing site was seared, and bushes had been burned to ash. There were 4 deep imprints in the dirt, spaced in a rectangular pattern, as if made by heavy landing pads. Trembling with adrenaline, Zamora reported the encounter to the state police, and soon the Air Force was notified. Project Blue Book sent investigators, including Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the project's scientific consultant. Hynek arrived skeptical. After all, he had spent years offering conventional explanations for sightings, but he left Socorro impressed by the evidence. He spoke at length with Zamora, a well-respected policeman known for his honesty. He examined the scorched bushes and pod marks. Hynek could find no easy way to dismiss the incident. Socorro quickly became one of Project Blue Book's unknown cases, meaning the investigators concluded that no known aircraft, natural phenomenon, or hoax could account for what happened. To Hynek, Socorro was a turning point. If Zamora's experience was taken at face value, it suggested that whoever or whatever was behind the UFO mystery occasionally landed and walked around. This was not just lights in the sky anymore, it was something tangible. By the mid-1960s, public interest in UFOs spiked again, driven in part by waves of new sightings. In 1965 and 1966, UFO reports flooded Blue Book at rates not seen since the early 50s. One series of sightings in Michigan in March 1966 caused quite a stir. Dozens of citizens, including police officers and college students, witnessed strange hovering lights over swamps and fields on consecutive nights. Under pressure to give an explanation, Blue Book's Dr. Hynek travelled to Michigan and, at a press conference, suggested that the witnesses might have mistaken swamp gas, spontaneously igniting marsh methane, for something unearthly. This swamp gas explanation was met with ridicule and anger by many who had seen the lights. They knew they hadn't simply observed swamp fumes, and they felt the Air Force was dismissing them as fools. The public outcry was so great that it caught the attention of Congress. Hearings were held, and for the first time some in Washington openly questioned whether Blue Book was capable of objectively investigating the phenomenon. In response to the growing controversy, the Air Force commissioned an independent scientific study of UFOs in late 1966. A team based at the University of Colorado, led by physicist Dr. Edward Condon, was given access to Blue Book's files and spent nearly 2 years examining a select batch of UFO cases in detail. In early 1969, the Condon Committee issued its lengthy report. The conclusion was clear. In the panel's view, UFOs had not yielded any significant scientific discoveries in over 2 decades and were unlikely to be of extraterrestrial origin. They recommended that the Air Force end Project Blue Book and cease official UFO investigations. And so, in December 1969, Project Blue Book was formally terminated. Blue Book's final statistics were impressive on the surface. It had collected 12,618 reports, of which all but 701 had been explained or labelled identified. The Air Force announced that in its judgment, none of the UFO sightings investigated posed any threat to national security, nor had they found any evidence of advanced technology beyond current earthly capabilities, and no evidence at all of extraterrestrial vehicles. To many, especially in the military and scientific establishment, this was a comforting conclusion. It was as if a long, strange chapter had been closed. For others, however, the end of Blue Book was far from the end of the mystery. Those 701 cases still classified as unknown lingered in the minds of UFO researchers. And some of Blue Book's own personnel were not entirely satisfied either. J. Allen Hynek, who had spent years as Blue Book's consultant, publicly disagreed with Condon's conclusions after the project ended. Hynek felt that some UFO reports indeed pointed to something truly anomalous that deserved continued study. With Project Blue Book shut down, the US government largely exited the UFO business, at least officially, for a number of years. The files were archived, the phone on the UFO hotline stopped ringing, and for a time the subject receded from the headlines. Yet the phenomenon itself did not magically stop. All around the world, and even in America's own backyards, unexplained aerial encounters continued to occur. In fact, as the 1970s dawned, a new chapter of the UFO story was quietly underway, one that would play out not in the public eye as much as in military installations and far-flung locales at the tense height of the Cold War. The secrecy and skepticism that had grown around the topic during the Blue Book era meant that many of these later encounters would remain little known for years. But as the Iron Curtain lifted and archives gradually opened, a trove of formerly secret UFO reports from the Cold War era came to light. These declassified files confirmed that the strange sightings and encounters were not just imagination or isolated incidents. They were real enough to concern governments at the highest levels. And yet, the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. What were these craft? Who, or what, was operating them? The Cold War had ended without yielding a clear answer. All that was left were the testimonies of those who were there, the radar traces and memoranda in dusty files, and the enduring sense of wonder and unease that those encounters evoked. For the men and women in uniform who witnessed these events, the experiences were life-changing. Many had been sworn to secrecy or felt compelled by duty to stay silent for years. But eventually, some of their voices would be heard. In our next chapter, we will hear directly from those witnesses in uniform, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and officers who came forward to share their extraordinary stories, lending credibility and gravity to a subject long relegated to the fringe. The stage was set for a new era of revelation, as the keepers of those Cold War secrets finally stepped out of the shadows. As the Cold War deepened in the late 1960s and beyond, reports of mysterious objects intruding into restricted military airspace grew increasingly alarming. Unlike the earlier years of civilian UFO sightings, many of these encounters occurred around sensitive nuclear weapons sites, where the stakes could not have been higher. Both the United States and the Soviet Union quietly documented incidents in which unidentified craft appeared to demonstrate a curious interest in mankind's most destructive arsenals. One chilling episode unfolded before dawn on March 24, 1967, at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Deep underground in a concrete capsule, Air Force Lieutenant Robert Salas was on duty overseeing a flight of intercontinental ballistic missiles. In the pre-dawn darkness, his security guard's topside phoned in frantic reports. A glowing red object was silently hovering just outside the front gate of the missile facility. As Salas picked up the line to ask for details, klaxon alarms suddenly rang out from his control panel. One by one, nearly all 10 of the Minuteman nuclear missiles under his watch went into a no-go condition, becoming inexplicably non-operational. These missiles were designed with multiple redundant systems, and having so many fail all at once was beyond ordinary explanation. Stunned, Salas and his commander checked and rechecked their instruments. The missiles simply had shut down. Above ground, guards reported that the reddish, saucer-like craft had silently sped away moments after the malfunctions occurred. Within 24 hours, Air Force teams scrambled to diagnose the glitch. No definitive cause was found. Officially, the incident was chalked up to an unspecified technical malfunction. But those present that morning were left with an uneasy question. Did the strange object have anything to do with the unprecedented shutdown of nuclear missiles? For decades, this event remained buried in secrecy, until it was eventually declassified, and former officers like Salas spoke out about what they experienced. Across the ocean, in the Soviet Union, similar unsettling incidents were whispered about in classified circles. In October 1982, at a strategic missile base near Perm in the Ural region, soldiers and officers witnessed an uncanny visitation. A spherical UFO, shining with a dull silver glow, reportedly descended over the base's restricted zone one evening. As the object hovered, the base's alarm systems activated, and incredibly, several nuclear missiles inexplicably initiated launch sequences on their own. In the control bunker, lights and indicators flashed, as if an order to fire had been given. It was a doomsday scenario that should be impossible without multiple layers of authenticated commands. For a few terrifying moments, panic gripped the launch crews as they frantically worked to cancel the countdowns. Just as suddenly as it began, the anomalous activation stopped. The mysterious sphere zipped away into the night sky, and the launch systems returned to standby. Soviet commanders were aghast. An intensive investigation followed, but like the American incident at Malmstrom, no clear cause was found for the missile system's brief, uncommanded behavior. The incident was kept strictly secret, known only to top officials and the men who had been on duty. Years later, after the Cold War, some of those Soviet veterans would quietly recount that night, and their conviction that whatever that hovering orb was, it had nearly pushed them to the brink of disaster. Not all Cold War encounters were tied to nuclear arms, however. Some unfolded high in the skies between military pilots and uncanny aerial intruders. One of the most extraordinary such confrontations occurred on the night of September 18, 1976, in the tense atmosphere of post-revolution Iran. At Tehran's Shahroki Air Base, reports flooded in of a bright, unknown object hovering over the city. The Imperial Iranian Air Force scrambled 2 F-4 Phantom II jet interceptors to investigate. Captain Parviz Jafari, piloting the second jet, raced through the sky, guided by ground radar, which was tracking a brilliant object ahead. As Jafari closed in, he could see the UFO with his own eyes, a radiant diamond of flashing colors, red, green, blue, and orange lights so intense he couldn't discern a solid form behind them. The object suddenly released a smaller glowing orb that streaked directly toward Jafari's F4. In that instant, his weapons control panel went dark and his missiles would not launch. Alarmed, he tried evasive action, and the small orb circled back to rejoin the larger craft. Jafari's jet instruments had gone haywire. Communication with ground control crackled with static. Only after he broke off pursuit did his control panel flicker back to life. Regaining composure, the captain attempted another intercept. This time the UFO sped off, easily outdistancing the advanced fighter. Both perplexed and awestruck, Jafari returned to base safely. In the days that followed, Iranian generals pored over radar prints and pilot testimony. They even consulted with US defense officials. A detailed report of the incident made its way into a classified US intelligence memo, which decades later was quietly declassified. It confirmed the pilot's accounts. Multiple airborne objects were confirmed by radar and visual contact, and one F4 had suffered unexplained equipment failure whenever it drew near the UFO, only to have its systems resume normal function when the jet turned away. The Tehran incident remains one of the most compelling military UFO encounters on record, a case where experienced pilots engaged a technology that seemed far beyond their own and lived to tell the tale. 4 years later, in December 1980, another extraordinary encounter would unfold, this time on a quiet forest edge in England, involving United States Air Force personnel stationed abroad. Just beyond the perimeter of RAF Woodbridge, a British airbase on lease to the US Air Force, housing nuclear weapons in secret, security patrols reported strange lights descending into the dark Rendlesham forest. On the night after Christmas, 1980, 3 American airmen ventured into the woods to investigate what they thought might be a downed aircraft. Navigating by flashlight between tall pines, they came upon a glowing object, unlike anything they expected. A triangular craft, roughly the size of a small car, hovering a couple of feet above the forest floor. It had a smooth black surface with strange symbols etched or embossed on its side, and it emanated a bright white light from its top. One airman, Sergeant Jim Peniston, later recounted that he managed to approach close enough to touch the craft, feeling warmth and a static energy in the air. After several minutes, the triangle silently lifted through the trees and zipped away at incredible speed. Dazed and disbelieving, the airmen reported the incident to their superiors. 2 nights later, the lights returned. This time, the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, led a larger team into the forest with radiation detectors and audio recorders in hand. In the chilly early hours of December 28th, they witnessed multiple strange lights maneuvering through the trees and in the sky above. At one point, Holt and his team observed a bright red light that moved about and then exploded into 5 white objects. One of these objects beamed a narrow laser-like shaft of light down near their feet, as if scanning the ground before darting off. On Holt's handheld tape recorder, which was running throughout the incident, one can hear the palpable astonishment in the men's voices as they struggle to describe the phenomena unfolding around them. The next day, when daylight came, investigators found triangular impressions pressed into the forest floor at the site where Peniston said the craft had landed. They also measured higher than normal radiation readings in the soil and on the trees nearby. Holt promptly wrote an official memo to the UK Ministry of Defence describing the unexplained lights in Rendlesham Forest. The incident was initially kept quiet. Both US and UK authorities downplayed it, insisting publicly that nothing of defence significance had occurred. But among those on the base, the events became the stuff of legend. Years later, as the story got out, the Rendlesham Forest incident was dubbed Britain's Roswell, and it remains perhaps the most famous UFO case in UK history. What makes it particularly compelling are the credentials of the witnesses, trained military officers, and the physical evidence left behind. Like other Cold War encounters, no definitive explanation has ever been offered by officials. Through the 1970s and 1980s, such reports continued to trickle in from bases and battlefields around the world. They came from American missile silos on the Great Plains, from remote Soviet test ranges in Kazakhstan, from Navy ships at sea, and from war zones in Vietnam. Typically, these incidents were classified and kept out of public view, deemed too sensitive or too embarrassing to disclose. After all, if objects of unknown origin could penetrate the most secure installations on Earth and tamper with weapons or outfly jet fighters, admitting this openly was fraught with implications. It was easier to sweep these stories under the rug. But whispers of them spread among those in the know. By the time the Cold War came to a close in the early 1990s, a picture was emerging. Both superpower militaries had experienced perplexing encounters with what appeared to be technologically advanced craft of unknown origin. Some high-ranking officials had begun to take the issue seriously, at least behind closed doors. In the waning years of the 20th century, small cracks of acknowledgement started to appear. Retired officers on both sides cautiously spoke of the other adversary that had engaged them during those tense decades. Not a human enemy, but an elusive presence that seemed to monitor our darkest capabilities. As the Iron Curtain lifted and archives gradually opened, a trove of formerly secret UFO reports from the Cold War era came to light. These declassified files confirmed that the strange sightings and encounters were not just imagination or isolated incidents. They were real enough to concern governments at the highest levels. And yet, the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. What were these craft? Who, or what, was operating them? The Cold War had ended without yielding a clear answer. All that was left were the testimonies of those who were there, the radar traces and memoranda in dusty files, and the enduring sense of wonder and unease that those encounters evoked. For the men and women in uniform who witnessed these events, the experiences were life-changing. Many had been sworn to secrecy, or felt compelled by duty to stay silent for years. But eventually, some of their voices would be heard. In our next chapter, we will hear directly from those witnesses in uniform, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and officers who came forward to share their extraordinary stories, lending credibility and gravity to a subject long relegated to the fringe. The stage was set for a new era of revelation, as the keepers of those Cold War secrets finally stepped out of the shadows. In the aftermath of the Cold War, once classified stories of UFO encounters began to emerge, carried into the light by the very people who had been sworn to silence. These were generals, pilots, radar operators, and intelligence officers, individuals in uniform whose words carried weight and credibility. As they stepped forward, one after another, they transformed the UFO narrative from one of tabloid lore into a legitimate matter of public record. Their testimonies, delivered in measured tones and often under oath, painted a consistent and startling picture. That unidentified flying objects were not only real, but had at times engaged with our military forces and nuclear installations, and that governments had long known more than they let on. One of the earliest high-profile revelations came from a man who had stood at the apex of the space age, Gordon Cooper, one of NASA's original Mercury astronauts. Cooper had been an Air Force pilot in the 1950s, and he publicly recalled an incident in which, as a young test pilot stationed at Edwards Air Force Base, he witnessed a sleek metallic disc land on a dry lake bed in broad daylight. A camera crew under his command filmed the craft at close range. Cooper reported that he could clearly see the disk's circular shape and domed top as it hovered, then abruptly shot away at tremendous speed. Following protocol, he sent the developed film up the chain of command. It was the last he ever saw of it. For decades, Cooper said little about this event, but in the late 1970s, feeling that the public had a right to know, he shared his experience in interviews and even wrote a letter to the United Nations, urging world leaders to seriously study the UFO phenomenon. Coming from a celebrated astronaut, a man who had orbited the Earth, his words made many take notice. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, more insiders followed. They ranged from distinguished military officers to FAA air traffic controllers and aerospace engineers. In 2001, a landmark press conference was held at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., organized by a group of former government officials and military personnel seeking to disclose their experiences. One by one, about 20 witnesses in suits and service uniforms stood at the microphone and recounted extraordinary events they had either witnessed firsthand or learned of in the course of their duties. Among them was retired Air Force Sergeant Clifford Stone, who spoke softly about being part of recovery teams for crashed unknown objects. Navy Commander Graham Bethune described seeing a massive disk emerge from the ocean while he was flying a military transport plane. Perhaps most jarring was the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. Yes, the very same Holt from the 1980 Rendlesham incident, who now publicly affirmed the reality of what he and his men encountered in that forest. Holt asserted that the Rendlesham UFO had been real, and that both the US and UK governments knew far more than they admitted. As he spoke, he held up his official memo as evidence, challenging the authorities to refute the documented data. The media reaction to this 2001 Disclosure Project press event was mixed. Some reporters treated it as a curiosity. Others were genuinely intrigued by the caliber of the speakers. For those in the room, however, the message was clear. These were serious, sober individuals with little to gain and much to lose by coming forward. Yet they felt duty-bound to share their experiences for the greater good. Their collective testimony conveyed that UFOs were not just lights in the sky, but structured craft of unknown origin, and that secrecy surrounding them had been enforced at high levels of government for decades. A particularly powerful moment came in September 2010, again at the National Press Club, when another gathering of former US Air Force officers stepped forward with a focused message. These were men who had served as launch commanders and security officers at nuclear missile facilities during the 1960s and 1970s. Men like Robert Salas of the Malmstrom incident and Colonel Walt Fiegel, and they asserted that UFOs had indeed tampered with nuclear weapons on multiple occasions. One by one, they described incidents where brightly glowing objects hovered near missile sites, and shortly thereafter, those missiles were knocked offline. Retired Captain Robert Salas recounted for the press the eerie morning at Malmstrom AFB when his Minuteman missiles became inert while a red orb pulsated outside the gate. Another officer, retired Colonel Charles Holt from Rendlesham, took the podium and backed up Salas by describing how, in the UK in 1980, a UFO had shone a beam down into the nuclear storage bunkers at RAF Bentwaters, as if exhibiting a concerned interest in humanity's nuclear arsenal. The implication of their combined testimony was staggering. Perhaps, they suggested, whoever was piloting these unknown craft was sending a message about the perils of nuclear war. Reporters' pencils scratched, cameras clicked, and for a moment, a normally skeptical Washington press corps was left rather speechless. It wasn't only Americans who spoke out. High-ranking officials from other countries also broke their silence. In France, after a government-sanctioned study of UFOs, a group of retired generals and scientists published the Cometa Report in 1999, which concluded that the extraterrestrial hypothesis was a credible explanation for a small number of truly unexplained cases. In the UK, the Ministry of Defence's longtime UFO investigator, Nick Pope, a civilian but working within the MOD, went public in the mid-2000s, confirming that the British government had documented several high-caliber cases that defied conventional explanation. Even in Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, former military officials hinted at secret investigations of UFO incidents, including that frightening 1982 missile base episode, acknowledging that they too had been mystified and concerned. By the early 21st century, the stigma that once surrounded the UFO topic was slowly eroding, thanks in large part to these uniformed witnesses. The conversation began to shift from giggles about little green men to sober discussions of flight safety, national security, and the limits of human knowledge. In 2017, the world learned that the Pentagon had quietly run a modern UFO investigation program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, for years, and it had even obtained intriguing gun camera videos of encounters between US Navy fighter jets and unknown objects exhibiting astounding maneuvers. When those videos, showing tic-tac-shaped craft darting and rotating with no visible means of propulsion, were released, some of the very pilots involved, such as Commander David Fravor of the US Navy, went on record to describe the encounters in detail. Their professionalism and clarity further boosted the credibility of the subject. It was as if the barrier of disbelief had finally cracked. Suddenly, Pentagon officials and elected politicians were openly acknowledging that unidentified aerial phenomena are real and worthy of investigation. Looking back, it's striking how far the conversation has come. What began as hushed reports in military files has become an above-board dialogue involving global media and government forums. And at the heart of this transformation have been the voices of those who served. These witnesses in uniform, whether an Air Force colonel recounting a forest encounter, a Navy pilot describing a high-speed chase over the ocean, or a missile commander reliving the moment his doomsday weapons were inexplicably shut down, have lent gravitas to a topic long relegated to science fiction. Their courage in speaking out has invited us to set aside preconceived notions and simply listen, to consider that perhaps we truly are not alone in observing the skies above. As we conclude this journey through the declassified files and personal accounts of UFOs and alien secrets, a gentle sense of wonder remains. The night is quiet and vast. The universe beyond our blue skies stretches infinitely, dotted with mysteries. And now, more than ever, humanity faces that cosmos with eyes and minds wide open, a bit more willing to question, to explore, and to be humbled by the possibility that we are part of a larger story still unfolding among the stars. It is early July of 1947, in the quiet, high desert of New Mexico. Dawn breaks over a remote ranch as W. Mac Brazel rides out after a night of summer storms. Under the fresh morning light, he notices something unusual scattered across the landscape, pieces of shimmering material glinting on the ground. Stepping down from his horse, Brazel kneels to pick up a fragment. It looks like foil, yet unlike any foil he's seen before. Incredibly light and thin, it springs back to its original shape after he crumples it. All around, the debris field stretches wide, with bits of rubbery strips and sticks inscribed with purplish symbols that resemble no writing he knows. Puzzled, Brazel collects a few pieces and later heads into town to report his find. At the local sheriff's office in Roswell, he empties a sack of this strange debris onto the desk, hoping for an explanation. Sheriff George Wilcox is equally baffled. Such material doesn't seem to come from any conventional aircraft or weather balloon that he's aware of. Unsure of how to proceed, Wilcox contacts the nearby Roswell Army Airfield, which had jurisdiction over military matters in the region. Soon, intelligence officer Major Jesse Marcel and another soldier are dispatched to investigate Brazel's discovery. Marcel follows Brazel out to the ranch site, the vast plain still littered with silvery scraps from whatever had fallen during the storm. Together, they gather as much as they can, piling odd metallic foil, lightweight wooden-like beams, and chunks of something that looks like tough parchment or rubber into their vehicles. Marcel is an experienced officer who had handled all manner of military hardware, yet he is mystified by these materials. Holding one of the foil-like pieces, he finds it won't stay bent or torn. In his hands is a puzzle that defies his military training, and a small thrill of wonder runs through him at the possibilities. By the time Marcel returns to base with the recovered debris, word of the find has made its way up the chain of command. For the past 2 weeks, ever since a civilian pilot in Washington state reported seeing a formation of mysterious, saucer-like objects darting through the skies, the country has been buzzing about flying discs. Now it seems the Army Air Force actually has one in its possession. Colonel William Blanchard, the base commander, authorizes a press release to share the astonishing news. On July 8, 1947, the headline of the Roswell Daily Record proclaims that the military has captured a flying disc on a ranch near Roswell. For a brief moment, it seems the mystery might be solved on that summer day in 1947. Could it really be that an object from beyond Earth had come tumbling down to the New Mexico desert? Public imagination runs wild. Phone lines buzz at radio stations and newspaper offices as people clamour for details. The notion of a flying disc in military hands feels like a scene from a science fiction thriller made real. Yet, almost as quickly as the sensational story breaks, it is eclipsed by a sudden change in the official narrative. Within a day, the Army Air Force retracts their flying disc announcement and issues a new explanation. At a hurried press conference at Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, Major Marcel is directed to pose with pieces of the recovered debris for photographers. But now the debris displayed appears mundane. Shredded bits of a rubber balloon and a crumpled foil radar target are spread on the floor. Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commanding officer in Fort Worth, declares that it turns out to be nothing extraordinary after all. Just the remnants of a fallen weather balloon, he says, not a flying saucer. The story of a captured alien craft is officially debunked almost before it began. Many in the press and public accept this swift reversal without protest. It is, after all, the early days of the Cold War, and trust in the US military is strong. If the Army Air Force says it was a weather balloon, then that must be the end of it. Mac Brazel, the rancher who found the debris, even gives an interview where he seems to agree it was all a mistake, just a balloon with tinfoil and rubber. But those who were closest to the debris, Major Marcel and others on the recovery team, privately harbour doubts. The material they handled out on that remote ranch did not strike them as something so ordinary. After the initial excitement, the Roswell incident effectively disappears from the headlines. For 3 decades, it lies dormant in the public consciousness, a briefly lit fuse that fizzled out. Yet whispers persist in the Roswell area. Some locals murmur that Brazel was taken into military custody for a few days and pressured to keep quiet. Others recall that unusual military activity occurred in the days following the crash, with cordoned-off areas and rumours of another crash site closer to the nearby town of Corona. Officially, however, nothing more is said. Roswell slips into obscurity, remembered only as a minor misunderstanding, at least for the time being. It isn't until the late 1970s that the embers of the Roswell story glow back to life. In 1978, nuclear physicist and UFO researcher Stanton T. Friedman tracks down the now retired Major Jesse Marcel. Sitting in Marcel's living room, Friedman listens intently as the former intelligence officer breaks his silence after decades of keeping the secret. Marcel insists that what he recovered in 1947 was no weather balloon. He describes the remarkable properties of the debris, the thin foil that could not be permanently creased, the lightweight beams with strange symbols, and pieces that looked like no aircraft part he'd ever known. Marcel's conviction is clear. He believes the army concocted the weather balloon story to hide something truly extraordinary. Marcel's testimony opens the floodgates. Other witnesses and families of those involved begin to speak up. The late Colonel Blanchard's family recalls how he had always taken the UFO question seriously after Roswell. A mortician in Roswell, Glenn Dennis, recounts being called to the army base back in 1947 on a strange errand, providing child-sized coffins and encountering nurses who hinted at alien bodies recovered from a crash. A former ranch hand, Gerald Anderson, claims he came upon a crashed craft and saw occupants, small, lifeless beings, before being escorted away by soldiers. Piece by piece, these recollections weave a dramatically different tale than the old weather balloon explanation. The emerging story is both thrilling and unsettling. If these accounts are to be believed, not only did something exotic crash near Roswell, but the army recovered not just fragments of unknown material, but possibly the bodies of non-human beings. The implications are staggering. Proof that we are not alone, whisked away under a veil of secrecy. By the early 1980s, Roswell has transformed from a forgotten footnote into the centerpiece of a growing belief that the US government has hidden evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. Books and articles delve into the case, each adding new layers, some based on interviews with aging witnesses, others on speculation and anonymous sources. The Roswell incident becomes famous worldwide, turning the once sleepy town into a mecca for UFO enthusiasts. Researchers pore over old military documents, searching for hints of a cover-up. They find some intriguing leads. A memorandum from FBI archives, written in July 1947, shows FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover scrawling a note about wanting access to the disk that Army officers recovered, but being denied that access by the military. To those convinced that something otherworldly fell at Roswell, even such small crumbs are viewed as confirmation that the government knows more than it ever let on. Under growing public pressure decades later, the US Air Force finally revisited the Roswell case. In the mid-1990s, nearly 50 years after the incident, the Air Force released a series of official reports aiming to put the matter to rest once and for all. The first report, published in 1994, acknowledged that the original weather balloon explanation had indeed been a cover-up, but not for an alien spacecraft. It claimed the debris actually came from a top-secret program called Project Mogul, which in 1947 had launched high-altitude balloons equipped with sensors to detect Soviet nuclear tests. According to this report, one of those balloon arrays crashed on Bresl's ranch, and its foil reflectors, rubber materials, and wooden sticks accounted for all the strange debris found that day. For a moment, this explanation seemed plausible enough. Project Mogul had been classified in 1947 after all, so it made sense that the army could not reveal its existence and might use a weather balloon story as a convenient cover. But the report left some questions unanswered. Why did witnesses like Jesse Marcel insist decades later that the material they handled was unlike any balloon components? Could their memories have grown exaggerated over time? Or was the Air Force omitting something? Evidently sensing that not everyone was convinced, the Air Force followed up in 1997 with a second report addressing the most sensational aspect of the Roswell lore: the alleged alien bodies. This time, the explanation was that those who claimed to have seen extraterrestrial corpses were likely recalling something far less otherworldly. The report asserted that they had probably seen crash test dummies used in high-altitude parachute experiments during the 1950s, and later misremembered those as part of the 1947 incident. According to this theory, witnesses had inadvertently mixed up timelines in their recollections, grafting the memory of mid-1950s dummy retrieval operations onto the Roswell story. These official explanations, thorough as they were, satisfied some, but rang hollow for others. To many UFO researchers and enthusiasts, the Project Mogul and crash test dummy narratives seemed too neatly tailored to explain away the extraordinary elements of the story. Die-hard believers saw the Air Force reports as just another layer of cover-up, a belated attempt to close the book on Roswell without addressing the most compelling witness testimonies. And so, despite the Air Force's confident declaration of case closed, the Roswell incident continued to loom large in the public imagination. By the turn of the millennium, Roswell had become more than a case file. It was a cultural icon, a shorthand for suspected government cover-ups of cosmic secrets. The once obscure town now embraced its fame. The International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell attracts visitors from around the world, offering exhibits that chronicle every twist of the Roswell saga. Annual UFO festivals fill the streets with locals and tourists, mingling under banners of little green men. Even the streetlights in downtown Roswell are shaped like alien eyes, a playful tribute to the town's unique place in history. Yet behind the light-hearted tourism and novelty souvenirs, serious questions still linger for those seeking the truth. What really happened on that remote ranch so long ago? If remarkable debris, or even bodies, were retrieved, where did they go? And who has been privy to the real story all these years? What Roswell left in its wake was more than strange wreckage. It was the seed of a mystery that would continue to grow for decades. The incident sowed in the public an enduring sense of curiosity and doubt, an uneasy feeling that authorities might be concealing astonishing truths behind mundane explanations. In the years after Roswell, whenever another mysterious object was reported to have fallen from the sky, people couldn't help but wonder, is this the next Roswell? In many ways, that 1947 crash opened a door to a new era of fascination with the unknown, an era that was only just beginning. Roswell was not an isolated incident. In the years that followed, scattered reports emerged of other mysterious crashes and perplexing materials, each story adding to the growing enigma. If one strange object could fall from the sky and be hidden away, many wondered, could there be others? Rumours of crash recoveries and uncanny debris began to circulate from the late 1940s onward, suggesting that Roswell's secret might have been just the beginning. In fact, even before Roswell made headlines, a curious episode in the Pacific Northwest hinted that unidentified flying objects could sometimes leave very real traces behind. In June of 1947, near Maury Island in Washington state, a man named Harold Dahl claimed he witnessed something unbelievable while out on a boat in Puget Sound. As the story goes, Dahl saw 6 donut-shaped craft in the sky. One of them appeared to wobble and explode, raining down a shower of hot metallic slag onto the water and beach below. The falling debris allegedly killed his dog and even injured his son. Stunned and frightened, Dahl gathered some of the strange, dark fragments that had fallen from the sky. Dahl shared his astonishing account, and the physical fragments, with a local magazine publisher the following day. News of the Maury Island incident reached Kenneth Arnold, the same civilian pilot whose report of flying saucers earlier that month had sparked national attention. Arnold, curious and now somewhat of an expert by experience, travelled to meet Dahl and inspect the unusual debris. He was joined by 2 U.S. Army Air Force intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, who took custody of the samples for transport to a laboratory. But even as officials began to look into the case, Dahl claimed he was confronted by another, more sinister visitor. He recounted that a mysterious man dressed in a black suit approached him and gave a chilling warning. He should forget what he saw out on the water if he valued his life and family. Deeply unnerved, Dahl did as he was told and fell silent, even allegedly saying later that the whole thing was a hoax to dissuade further inquiry. Tragically, fate added another dark twist. The military B-25 plane carrying the two intelligence officers and the Maury Island samples crashed en route to their base, killing both men, with the debris seemingly lost and Dahl unwilling to further substantiate his story. The official investigation into Maury Island stalled. Authorities ultimately dismissed the incident as a hoax or misunderstanding, and it faded from the headlines. Yet for those few who had seen the slag and heard Dahl's story, the case left an eerie legacy. It introduced the idea that UFOs might leave behind physical evidence, and hinted at secretive forces eager to sweep such evidence away before the truth could surface. Less than a year later, in early 1948, another crash story emerged. This time in the sun-baked mesas near Aztec, New Mexico. The tale of the Aztec crash would become a subject of heated debate. According to accounts that circulated among a few insiders and were later popularized by a 1950 best-selling book, a large disc-shaped craft was said to have come down in a remote gulch. Picture the scene described: a silent metallic saucer, about 100 feet in diameter, embedded lightly in the scrubby brush, as perplexed ranchers or oil field workers stood by in disbelief. By some tellings, the craft was found largely intact, a ring of windows encircling its smooth hull. Peering through, the witnesses supposedly saw within the craft's cabin several motionless small bodies. As recovery teams from the nearby Air Force Base eventually arrived, they pried open a hatch to reveal these occupants. Little humanoid figures about 3 to 4 feet tall. Their features were eerily human-like, though their size and the metallic devices on their suits hinted at an otherworldly origin. As the story goes, the military cordoned off the area and worked swiftly to haul away the saucer and the bodies on flatbed trucks, warning locals to stay silent. An impressive tale, to be sure, and one that for a time was heralded by some flying saucer buffs as proof that Roswell was not a one-off event. However, as investigators dug deeper, the Aztec story began to unravel. Journalists and UFO researchers who tried to track down witnesses found only hearsay and second-hand claims. In the mid-1950s, an expose revealed that the key promoters of the tale, men who had touted inside knowledge of the crash, were in fact con artists. They had spun the yarn of the Aztec saucer as part of a scheme to lure investors, peddling a device they falsely claimed was based on alien technology. With their fraud laid bare, the Aztec crash was relegated to the realm of myth and hoax. Interestingly, even official agencies had briefly taken note of the fantastic claims. In March 1950, an FBI agent filed a memo to headquarters relaying a report that the Air Force had recovered not one, but 3 flying saucers in New Mexico, each with little humanoid bodies inside. Today, we know this extraordinary claim almost certainly stemmed from the same fabrications that fed the Aztec rumors. Once the hoax was exposed, the FBI memo was essentially marked as a dead end. Yet the fact that such a memo exists, preserved in agency files and later declassified, shows how even within the halls of government, the legend of crashed saucers and recovered aliens had gained a foothold, if only for a moment. Throughout the 1950s, additional reports and rumors of crashed discs flickered at the margins of public awareness. Stories came from all over. There were whispers of a downed saucer in the Rocky Mountains, and unconfirmed tales of mysterious wreckage being flown out of foreign locales. In one account, widely reported in newspapers in 1952, the Norwegian military supposedly recovered a metallic flying disc from a remote island of Spitsbergen. That story, too, faded away amid skepticism, with many concluding it was likely a case of mistaken identity or Cold War misinformation. Still, the recurrence of these crash narratives kept alive a tantalizing question. If even a single one of them were true, what incredible secrets might be gleaned from the hardware of an extraterrestrial craft? For many, even unverified stories like these were enough to stoke the imagination and keep speculation alive. While many crash rumors proved difficult to substantiate, a few incidents did offer something the others lacked: tangible, hard evidence in the form of unusual material. Perhaps the most celebrated of these occurred in 1957, near the coastal town of Ubatuba, Brazil. On a bright day over the Atlantic shore, fishermen were startled to see a glowing disk streaking across the sky toward the ocean. As they watched, the object suddenly erupted into a brilliant flash and disintegrated mid-air above the water. Moments later, small silvery fragments began plinking into the waves and onto the sandy beach. Curious and amazed, some of the fishermen waded in to retrieve pieces of the peculiar debris. What they collected were lightweight, metallic slivers that gleamed with a dull, silvery white sheen. These samples were forwarded to Brazilian authorities and eventually analyzed by laboratories. To the surprise of the scientists, the fragments turned out to be almost pure magnesium. Manufacturing metal of that extreme purity on Earth in 1957 would have been an expensive, specialized process. Such extreme purity raised eyebrows. If not extraterrestrial, how could such metal have been produced, and by whom? Skeptics posited that perhaps the fragments were high-grade magnesium from an earthly source or part of a military flare. But no clear prosaic source was ever identified, and to this day, the Ubatuba magnesium fragments remain an intriguing enigma, one of the rare instances where physical evidence from a UFO event was not only recovered, but subjected to scientific scrutiny. Not all mysterious materials were metallic. In some UFO encounters, witnesses described fibrous or web-like substances that drifted down from the sky after a close encounter. These ethereal strands, often dubbed angel hair, would appear in great quantity, only to evaporate or disintegrate soon after falling. One famous occurrence took place in 1954 over Florence, Italy. During a football match on a clear October day, players and spectators alike paused in astonishment as several shiny oval objects maneuvered above the stadium. Shortly after these objects departed, a fine filamentous material began floating down, glistening in the sun. It clung to trees and rooftops, but anyone who touched it found it vanished almost immediately, leaving behind an almost ghostly impression of something real, yet not quite tangible. Scientists who managed to collect samples before they disappeared were baffled. The material's composition was hard to pin down, and it dissipated upon handling. Some proposed it was nothing more than webs from migrating spiders, a natural phenomenon known to occur occasionally. But those who had witnessed the UFOs were not convinced by the mundane explanation. To them, the so-called angel hair was another mystifying clue. Perhaps some form of ionized air or excess energy released by an unknown propulsion system, materializing briefly into cottony strands. UFO encounters in the 1950s also left behind other perplexing signs, even when no fragments could be found. At sites where witnesses claimed a saucer had landed, people would later discover rings of scorched or flattened vegetation, as if something had pressed down from above or briefly scorched the earth with a burst of heat. Geiger counters sometimes registered higher levels of radiation in these landing circles than in the surrounding area. On lonely highways, drivers told of engines that suddenly stalled and headlights that dimmed when a glowing object floated overhead, only to mysteriously come back to life after the object flew off. These odd marks gave investigators something solid to scrutinize, even if their origin remained mysterious. For those who experienced it, this was a frightening demonstration of a UFO's mysterious influence on the world around us. Such effects were difficult to explain away entirely, hinting at powerful energies or forces at work. They provided investigators with measurable clues that something unusual had happened, yet without the craft itself or clear photographic proof, these clues remained frustratingly inconclusive. In fact, as the space age dawned, the US Air Force quietly prepared for the possibility of strange falls from the sky. Beginning in the late 1950s, special recovery teams were established under code names like Project Moon Dust, tasked with retrieving and examining objects that might crash to Earth. Officially, these teams were meant to deal with foreign satellites and space hardware, the detritus of the burgeoning Cold War race for the heavens. Unofficially, if something not of this Earth ever did plummet into a field or forest, moon dust would likely be on the scene. Decades later, references to these teams would surface in declassified documents, hinting that the government was actively collecting unusual aerial debris around the world, even if it never publicly admitted to recovering a flying saucer. Rumors swirled that military bases like Wright-Patterson Air Force Base became repositories for these recovered exotic materials, with secret vaults rumored to hold pieces of alien technology awaiting scientific analysis. By the end of the 1950s, the pattern was familiar. Officially, there was nothing to see, just misidentified aircraft, weather balloons, or hoaxes. But unofficially, the whispers and unconfirmed reports of crashes and recovered materials continued to capture the imagination of the public. It was a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, a story told in second-hand tales and leaked tidbits. If one were to believe even a fraction of these accounts, it would mean that humanity had in its hands fragments of technology from beyond the Earth, and perhaps even the remains of the beings who made them. Facing such extraordinary possibilities, a number of private citizens, including some former military personnel and concerned scientists, felt compelled to dig deeper. If the authorities had evidence they weren't sharing, then it fell to determined civilians to gather the facts themselves and shine light on the mystery. Outside the halls of government, a determined band of civilian researchers and enthusiasts rose to take on the challenge. Frustrated by the lack of answers, these individuals believed that if the truth was being kept under wraps, it was up to them to uncover it. Thus, almost in parallel with the secrecy of official programs, the late 1940s and 1950s saw the birth of ufology, the study of unidentified flying objects by private citizens, operating on curiosity, passion, and a shoestring budget. In the earliest days of the flying saucer era, civilian interest was already intense. Newspapers were flooded with letters and sighting reports from ordinary people who had seen something strange in the skies. Sensing the public fascination, a few enterprising figures took it upon themselves to organize the information. One of the first and most influential was Major Donald E. Kehoe, a retired U.S. Marine Corps officer. Kehoe had been a skeptic until he began researching the many pilot sightings that occurred in 1947 and 1948. What he found astonished him. Credible witnesses, often military pilots and experienced aircrew, were reporting objects that performed beyond the capabilities of any known aircraft. And yet the government seemed oddly dismissive or secretive about it. Smelling a cover-up, Kehoe in 1950 penned an article in True magazine titled "The Flying Saucers Are Real," followed by a book of the same name. In it, he boldly asserted that UFOs were interplanetary craft and that the US government was hiding what it knew. The article and book were a sensation, introducing millions of readers to the idea that their leaders might be concealing evidence of alien visitors. Kehoe's writings struck a chord with many people who felt that such claims deserved serious investigation. By the early 1950s, small UFO clubs and research groups were springing up across the country, organizing regular gatherings to share stories and plan investigations. In living rooms and community halls, these amateur sleuths held meetings to discuss recent sightings, pore over reports, and organize sky watches. They wrote newsletters and bulletins, trading information about strange lights seen over Texas or disc-shaped craft reported in the Australian outback. What these early civilian investigators lacked in resources, they made up for in enthusiasm and a genuine desire for the truth. They came from all walks of life, from engineers and school teachers to journalists and even former military officers, all united by the conviction that something truly important was going on overhead. As the 1950s progressed, two major organizations emerged to lead the civilian UFO inquiry. One was the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, founded in 1952 by a husband and wife team, Jim and Coral Lorenzen, in Arizona. The Lorenzens were among the first to attempt a scientific approach to the UFO mystery. APRO built a network of volunteer correspondents around the world, gathering case reports from as far away as South America and Europe. They were particularly open to extraordinary reports. APRO files included early accounts of UFO occupants and humanoid encounters that more cautious researchers shied away from. Under Coral Lorenzen's leadership, APRO's newsletter became a respected chronicle of sightings and a forum for debating theories, ranging from extraterrestrial visitations to unknown natural phenomena. Not only in America, but around the world, civilian UFO sleuths were mobilizing. During an enormous wave of sightings in Europe in 1954, for example, private groups in France collected hundreds of reports of strange craft darting through the skies and even landing in farmers' fields. Some of these European cases included accounts of small humanoid figures seen near landed saucers, astonishing claims that made headlines overseas. This global flood of reports reinforced what ufologists believed, that the phenomenon was real and not confined to any one nation, and that it would take an international effort to unravel it. For UFO researchers, Europe's 1954 saucer wave confirmed that the mystery was not just an American obsession, but a worldwide reality. It was evidence that wherever people looked up, something unexplainable might be looking back. The other, even more influential group was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, better known as NICAP. Established in 1956, NICAP aspired to bring UFO research into the mainstream. It wasn't just a club of enthusiasts. NICAP's board of governors included retired military brass, scientists, and even former CIA director Roscoe Hillencutter. With Major Donald Kehoe installed as NICAP's director, the organization became the authoritative civilian voice on the UFO subject. NICAP members meticulously collected sighting reports, focusing on those from reliable witnesses like pilots, police officers, and radar operators. They published their findings in regular reports and bombarded congressmen and journalists with case summaries that were difficult to ignore. NICAP's approach was one of measured, sober inquiry, but it also carried an undercurrent of outrage at the perceived government cover-up. Kehoe and his colleagues made no secret of their belief that the Air Force was withholding evidence of UFOs. In press releases and public statements, NICAP alleged that key UFO incidents were improperly explained away, and that the true extent of the phenomenon was being kept from the American people. This stance resonated with a public that was growing increasingly suspicious of official assurances that there's nothing to see here. After all, by the mid-1950s, numerous credible sightings had been reported. Airline pilots had chased glowing disks that outmaneuvered their planes. Entire formations of unknown objects had been tracked on military radar. And flap after flap of sightings had police and citizens alike looking upward in wonder. Each time, the military offered a mundane explanation, a weather balloon here, a meteor shower there, but many found those answers unconvincing. With every dismissal, more people came to suspect that the truth was being glossed over, and that the official explanations simply didn't fit the facts. By gathering and publishing reports like these, the civilian groups slowly chipped away at the wall of official skepticism. Their newsletters carried titles like The UFO Investigator and the April Bulletin, and reached not only enthusiasts, but also scientists and lawmakers curious to know more. These civilian efforts began to accumulate genuinely puzzling cases. Multiple witness events, photographs, physical trace evidence, the kind of documentation that begged for rigorous study. In some instances, NICAP's files on a given case were more complete than the Air Force's own, simply because witnesses trusted the civilian investigators more and were willing to share information with them that they might not have reported through official channels. Occasionally, respected scientists even came forward with their own sightings or support. Clyde Tombaugh, the astronomer famous for discovering Pluto, publicly acknowledged seeing strange lights and fireballs in the night sky that he could not explain. He advocated for a formal scientific inquiry into such phenomena. When someone of Tombaugh's stature hinted that something real might be behind the reports, it gave the civilian UFO researchers a boost of validation. If nothing else, it suggested that curiosity about UFOs was not limited to conspiracy buffs on the fringe, but quietly shared by some of the era's sharpest minds. Of course, not everyone in academia or the government welcomed the rise of ufology. Many scientists at the time still dismissed the subject as fringe nonsense, and the US Air Force's public relations spokesman often derided civilian UFO researchers as cranks or alarmists. There was an undeniable tension. The more the Air Force and mainstream science pushed the topic aside, the more these independent investigators felt vindicated in their stance that an unbiased look was not being taken. They pressed on, holding public lectures and writing letters to officials urging that UFO sightings be treated as a serious potential scientific problem rather than as a laughing matter. For example, Harvard astronomer Donald Menzel, one of the most vocal skeptics, published book after book during the 1950s, attempting to prove that every UFO sighting could be explained by trickery or misperception, from mirages to marsh gas. Menzel and others in academia often chastised the public for being gullible and insisted that flying saucers were a non-issue. Their dismissive voices were welcome support for the Air Force's position, and military spokesmen did not hesitate to quote such experts when telling Americans that all was well. Public awareness of the UFO topic was enormous by this time. Surveys in the late 1950s showed that almost everyone in America had heard of flying saucers, and a significant number believed the phenomenon was real and important. UFOs were no longer just a fad or a joke. They had become a matter of serious discussion at dinner tables and in the halls of government alike. For a subject barely a decade old, the flying saucers had managed to embed themselves firmly in the public imagination. Interestingly, it was the Air Force itself that provided these civilian researchers with the very term that defined their field. In 1952, Air Force officer Edward Ruppelt coined the phrase unidentified flying object to replace the catch-all slang of flying saucer. Civilian investigators eagerly adopted the more neutral, technical-sounding term. Before long, everyone was talking about UFOs, an acronym that acknowledged these sightings came in all manner of shapes, not just sources. And with that new term came a new identity, the ufologist, a somewhat tongue-in-cheek title for those who studied the subject, a title many wore with pride, despite the eyebrow-raising it sometimes elicited. One dramatic clash between UFO investigators and the establishment took place on national television. In 1958, Major Keyhoe was invited to speak about flying saucers on a live CBS broadcast. But when he began hinting that the Air Force was hiding crucial UFO information, the network unexpectedly cut the sound on his microphone. Millions of viewers watched, baffled that his words had been silenced mid-sentence. To NICAP and its supporters, the incident reeked of censorship and only reinforced their conviction that powerful forces wanted the UFO truth kept under wraps. This burgeoning ufology movement set the stage for the confrontations and conversations to come. Civilian researchers had built up a body of evidence and a chorus of voices asking hard questions, questions the government could not ignore forever. The struggle between citizen truth seekers and government gatekeepers was entering a new phase. And unbeknownst to those UFO sleuths, the government had indeed taken notice of their activities and the swelling public demand for answers. Behind closed doors, officials were already devising strategies to manage the UFO problem. Strategies that would soon become apparent to the keen observers in the civilian camp. The United States government's official response to the flying saucer phenomenon in the mid-20th century could be summed up in one word: denial. As sightings mounted and speculation swirled, the authorities consistently maintained that nothing unknown or extraterrestrial was behind the reports. To the public, the message was reassuringly simple. There's no mystery here, folks. But behind that facade of calm dismissal lay a much more complicated story of internal debates, secret studies, and mounting pressure to keep the UFO issue under tight control. From the late 1940s onward, the US Air Force was the lead agency handling UFO reports. Under public pressure, they launched a series of investigative projects with innocuous names. Project Sign in 1948, Project Grudge in 1949, and ultimately Project Blue Book in 1952. On the surface, these programs were meant to collect and analyze UFO sightings in search of explanations. In practice, their role often seemed to be more about explaining sightings away than truly explaining them. Officers assigned to Blue Book, a small office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, fielded calls from anxious citizens and curious reporters. Their job was usually to find a conventional explanation for each sighting. Was that eerie light in the sky a weather balloon? Probably. Those fast-moving dots on radar? Likely just temperature inversions. Time and again, Blue Book's investigators publicly concluded that nothing extraordinary was happening. Yet even as the Air Force spoke dismissively in public, internal discussions told a different tale. In the early days, some within Project Sign seriously entertained the extraterrestrial hypothesis. In fact, by late 1948, Sign's intelligence analysts drafted a document known as the Estimate of the Situation, which reportedly concluded that the best explanation for some of the baffling UFO reports was visitors from outer space. That bold conclusion made its way up to the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Hoyt Vandenberg, who promptly rejected it. Lacking concrete proof, like a recovered craft or clear photos, the estimate was deemed too speculative. According to later accounts, Vandenberg ordered all copies of the document destroyed. Project Sign was soon replaced by the more skeptical Project Grudge. Within the halls of the Pentagon, the lesson was clear. Officially, UFOs were not to be taken as alien craft. Project Grudge set the tone for what followed. Its final report in 1949 flatly stated that there was nothing to see. every UFO case examined was attributable to hoaxes, misidentifications, or mass hysteria. The message was that the flying saucer craze would fade away if people just stopped paying attention to it. And for a brief time, reports did die down. But they came roaring back in 1952, which would prove to be a pivotal year. UFO sightings surged to record levels that summer, punctuated by headline-grabbing events like the radar tracks of unknown objects over Washington, D.C. When those blips buzzed the nation's capital in July 1952, even the White House demanded answers. The Air Force hurriedly held the largest press conference since World War II to assure the public that nothing unusual was afoot. The official line was that temperature inversions in the atmosphere had fooled the radar operators. Many experts quietly doubted that explanation, but it served its purpose to calm public anxiety. Around that same time, even the respected Life magazine ran a headline asking, "Have we visitors from space?" reflecting a brief moment when the idea of extraterrestrial visitors was being taken semi-seriously in high places. Behind closed doors, however, the UFO wave of 1952 set off alarm bells in the highest levels of government. The CIA, which had been monitoring the Air Force's handling of the situation, grew concerned that the sheer volume of sightings might overwhelm air defense systems, or, worse, provide cover for some Soviet trick. In the midst of the Cold War, no possibility, however far-fetched, was off the table. What if the enemy could flood American skies with false UFO reports to confuse radar operators and then slip a real attack through? This worry led the CIA to take a hard look at the UFO problem late in 1952. CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith and his deputies weren't convinced flying saucers were alien craft, but they were very interested in how the public fascination with UFOs might pose a national security issue. They decided something had to be done to get a handle on the situation. In January 1953, the CIA sponsored a panel of top scientists to review the UFO evidence collected so far, headed by physicist Dr. H.P. Robertson of Caltech. The panel spent several days behind closed doors poring over radar reports, photographs, and sighting stories from military pilots. Their conclusion was that no UFO case they saw provided proof of a threat to national security, at least not from any extraterrestrial invaders. However, the panel was concerned about the American public's war nerves and the potential for mass panic. Their recommendation was not to hunt for aliens, but to dampen down public interest in UFOs as quickly as possible. In their final report, kept classified at the time, the Robertson panel advised the government to strip the mystique from flying saucers. They suggested enlisting psychologists, astronomers, and even the media to debunk UFO sightings and educate people about how ordinary objects could be misperceived as something extraordinary. If a sighting could be explained, they urged the Air Force to explain it loudly and clearly. If not, they implied it might be better to simply not draw attention to the unknowns. Crucially, the Robertson panel also recommended that civilian UFO groups be watched carefully. The panel members worried that some well-meaning UFO organizations could inadvertently be duped by enemy propaganda, or, worse, used as unwitting tools to stir up hysteria. They even floated the idea of having intelligence agencies infiltrate these groups to keep tabs on their activities. In the paranoid atmosphere of the 1950s Red Scare, such suggestions were taken seriously. Unknown to the public, the FBI and CIA did begin quietly monitoring some prominent UFO investigators, looking for signs of subversive elements or potential frauds. The leadership of groups like NICAP had no idea that some of their supposed allies or members might actually be reporting back to government handlers about the UFO community's doings. Empowered by the Robertson panel's recommendations, the Air Force stepped up its public relations campaign to demystify UFOs. In 1953 and 1954, a flurry of press releases, magazine articles, and even television appearances by Air Force personnel all hammered home the message that flying saucers weren't spaceships. One Air Force captain, Edward Ruppelt, who had been Blue Book's director and had actually coined the term UFO, published a book titled The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects in 1956. In it, Ruppelt walked a fine line. He acknowledged that some cases had been puzzling, but he ultimately towed the party line that there was no evidence of a cover-up or of alien visitation. To many readers, though, his insider perspective hinted at just how much the Air Force wasn't publicly saying. The lack of forthrightness only fueled further speculation that the government was hiding something. Indeed, the more the authorities tried to quash the UFO topic, the more the public's imagination seemed to run free. Throughout the mid-1950s, rumours thrived in the absence of clear information. Some whispered that the Air Force had recovered alien hardware and wasn't telling anyone. Stories of a secret Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where alien wreckage and even bodies were supposedly stored, began to take shape in the UFO subculture. Others believed that the flying saucers were actually advanced Soviet spycraft or secret US weapons being tested under cover of darkness, and that the government's denials were just smoke and mirrors around a military secret. For every official reassurance, there seemed to be a new conspiracy theory ready to sprout in its place. The tone of officialdom didn't help inspire trust. Often, when citizens wrote in with detailed UFO reports, they received form letter replies thanking them and explaining that nothing unusual had been found. Military spokesmen at press conferences would chuckle at UFO questions, making light of witnesses' accounts by suggesting they had seen Venus or perhaps been drinking a bit too much. This attitude of gentle mockery filtered down through much of the media and scientific establishment. UFOs became a topic often met with a chuckle in official circles, even as behind the scenes, intelligence agencies quietly collected information. Yet, beneath the jokes, polls were showing that a considerable percentage of Americans suspected their government wasn't being entirely honest about the whole thing. And so, a paradoxical situation emerged. The government insisted there was nothing to UFOs, while a large segment of the public suspected that UFOs were very real indeed, and that the authorities were covering them up. This dynamic of official silence and public speculation fed on itself. The less transparent the Air Force was about its investigations, the more people doubted the official story. Each unexplained radar contact brushed aside, each spectacular pilot encounter downplayed, only added to an accumulating sense that they know something they're not telling us. It didn't take long for the notion of a UFO cover-up to embed itself in popular culture. By the mid-1950s, imaginative ideas that today might sound like fringe conspiracy theories were making their way into print and rumour. Tales of mysterious men in black began to circulate. Sinister, black-suited strangers who supposedly showed up after spectacular UFO sightings to intimidate witnesses into silence. Some of these stories likely grew out of real incidents, like the Air Force intelligence officers quietly interviewing observers, or perhaps even the paranoia of a few overzealous UFO buffs. But as the legend of the men in black grew, it symbolized the darkest fear of the UFO-believing public, that there was a deliberate campaign to suppress the truth, one that might go to extreme lengths to do so. Meanwhile, the mainstream scientific community offered little comfort to those seeking validation of the phenomenon. Most scientists either ignored the subject or dismissed it outright. Now and then, a prominent figure like Harvard astronomer Donald Menzel would publish an article or book explaining away UFO sightings as misidentified natural phenomena and chastising the public for being so gullible. These skeptical voices were music to the Air Force's ears, and they often cited such experts in their own communications. However, other scientists quietly disagreed with the hardline skeptics, They felt that at least some UFO reports merited proper investigation. Unfortunately, voicing such opinions openly in the 1950s could be a career risk, so most kept their curiosity to themselves. All the while, the public's appetite for anything UFO-related continued to grow. The entertainment industry picked up on the fascination. Hollywood released a string of alien-themed movies, from invaders blowing up Washington in fantastical fiction to benevolent spacemen warning about humanity's nuclear follies. Though often far-fetched, these films and stories kept the idea of extraterrestrial visitors firmly in the public mind, blurring the line between science fiction and potential reality. Magazine stands featured sensational covers about flying saucers, and radio shows hosted lively debates for and against the existence of spaceships. In living rooms across America, people speculated freely. If the flying saucers were real, were they piloted by spies, by angels, or by creatures from another world? And why, many asked, would the government be so adamant that there was nothing to it, unless there was indeed something to hide? By the end of the 1950s, the gap between the official narrative and public belief had only widened. The Air Force had managed to avoid any admission of unexplained phenomena, yet UFOs had only entrenched themselves deeper into the public consciousness. Each denial was met with a knowing nod by a public that had grown used to reading between the lines. For many, it was easier to believe that the authorities were clamping down on the truth than to accept that every unexplained sighting had a mundane answer. Amid this atmosphere of secrecy and suspicion, a new kind of UFO story began to emerge from the fringes of public discourse, one that would shift the focus from lights in the sky to purported encounters on the ground. If officials would not openly tell the public what these phenomena were, some individuals were more than willing to step forward with astonishing claims of their own. Whispers spread about private citizens who said they not only saw UFOs up close, but even met their occupants face to face. These accounts, whether believed or not, would captivate the public and take the UFO lore in an even stranger direction. In the 1950s, even as the authorities clung to secrecy and skepticism, a very different kind of UFO story began to capture the public's imagination. These were the tales of the contactees, ordinary individuals who claimed extraordinary encounters, not just with mysterious lights in the sky, but with the supposed pilots of those craft. Unlike the official reports, which were dry and technical, the contactees' stories were vivid, personal, and often filled with cosmic grandeur. They spoke of meeting benevolent visitors from other planets, riding in flying saucers, and receiving profound messages meant for all humankind. One of the earliest and most famous contactees was a California amateur astronomer and self-proclaimed philosopher named George Adamski. On a clear November day in 1952, Adamski and a few friends were out in the Mojave Desert, sky-watching, when, by his account, a silvery disk swooped low over the dunes. Adamski ventured away from his group and, astonishingly, claimed to come face-to-face with a visitor from Venus. This being, whom Adamski later described as a youthful man with long blonde hair and calm grey eyes, communicated with him through gestures and telepathy. Calling the alien Orphan, Adamski said the spaceman imparted a gentle warning about humanity's nuclear weapons and the need for peace on Earth. After a short encounter, Orphan returned to his shimmering saucer, leaving Adamski awestruck and convinced he had been chosen as an intermediary for the Space Brothers. When Adamski went public with his story, complete with photographs he had taken of alleged Venusian scout ships, he became a media sensation. He co-authored a best-selling book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, and travelled the world lecturing about the wise and peaceful extraterrestrials living on our planetary neighbours. To his believers, Adamski was a brave messenger, spreading a hopeful gospel of cosmic brotherhood. To skeptics, he was spinning a fairy tale as fantastical as any science fiction. Adamski was far from the only person in those years to report friendly chats with alien visitors. A whole wave of contactees followed in his footsteps throughout the 1950s, each adding their own twist to the narrative of benevolent spacefarers. In 1952, a Nevada man named Truman Bethurum claimed that while working late one night on a desert road, his truck was suddenly surrounded by glowing craft. He said he was invited aboard a landed saucer and introduced to its captain, a charming woman named Aura Raines from the planet Clarion. Bethurum recounted late-night meetings with Aura on multiple occasions. She spoke with him, in perfect English, about life on her world, and even offered him tidbits of futuristic wisdom before her ship departed. Around the same time, a Los Angeles sign painter, Orfeo Angelucci, began publishing pamphlets describing how space brothers in shimmering craft had stopped him along a highway and shared spiritual insights into human destiny. Others soon emerged. An Illinois farmer, Buck Nelson, insisted he flew to Mars on a UFO and came back with a pet dog from outer space. A New Jersey sign maker, Howard Menger, claimed he had spent his youth chatting with friendly Saturnians in the woods behind his house. By the mid-1950s, these self-professed ambassadors to the aliens were drawing sizable crowds at conventions and gathering their own devoted followers, all eager for details about life on Venus, Mars, or planets beyond. The contactees' stories had common themes. Almost always, the extraterrestrials were depicted as human-like, often indistinguishable from an attractive person, except for an air of wisdom or a peculiar accent. These space visitors, sometimes said to hail from Venus or Mars, other times from planets unseen by earthly telescopes, were uniformly concerned about Earth's future. Through the contactees, they pleaded for an end to war and nuclear testing, and for humanity to live in harmony with one another and with the planet. In an era when school children practiced duck and cover drills under the shadow of the atomic bomb, such messages held a powerful appeal. The Space Brothers, as they were fondly called, were portrayed not as conquerors or monsters, but as enlightened guardians, saddened by our strife, and hoping to guide us onto a better path. Mainstream scientists and serious UFO investigators, however, were deeply skeptical of the contactees' claims. To groups like NICAP and APRO, which strove to present UFO research as a legitimate, fact-based pursuit, the contactee movement was at best a distraction, and at worst, a fraudulent sideshow. Major Donald Kehoe and his NICAP colleagues flatly rejected the contactees' stories as unproven and implausible. They pointed out that not a shred of tangible evidence accompanied these fantastical accounts. No clear photographs of the alleged aliens themselves. Adamski's widely publicized saucer photos were hotly disputed. No artifacts beyond the normal trinkets one could find on Earth, and no verifiable records of the meetings. Furthermore, many contactees seemed to relish the spotlight and the proceeds from their book sales and speaking tours, raising suspicions that profit, not cosmic enlightenment, might be their true motive. The result was a schism in the UFO community. On one side stood the contactees and their believers, treating UFO encounters almost as spiritual revelations with moral teachings. On the other side were the nuts and bolts investigators, who cringed at what they saw as wild tales, undermining the credibility of the genuine UFO mystery. Regardless of the skepticism from scientists and serious ufologists, the contactees undeniably left their mark on popular culture. Through them, the image of aliens in the public mind shifted, away from bug-eyed invaders intent on conquest, toward wise, human-appearing mentors concerned for our welfare. Their narrative was comforting. Perhaps the universe was populated by benevolent elders watching over us during our troubled adolescence as a civilization. Some found this idea inspiring, almost religious in nature. At Giant Rock in California's Mojave Desert, charismatic contactee George Van Tassel hosted huge yearly gatherings. Hundreds of believers camped under the stars, listening as Van Tassel purported to relay messages from a cosmic being named Ashtar through an outdoor intercom loudspeaker system. In the cool desert night, attendees would hush as a disembodied, authoritative voice echoed over the dunes, taken by the faithful as the words of a space commander offering guidance to humanity. Many in the crowd described feeling an electric charge in the atmosphere, a sense that, at any moment, a saucer might descend to join the convocation. Such scenes, part campground revival, part science fiction theatre, illustrated how deeply the UFO contact mythos had woven itself into the fabric of popular culture by the end of the 1950s. Some contactees achieved a kind of fame akin to spiritual gurus. In 1957, a California enthusiast named Gabriel Green founded a national club for saucer believers, hosting conventions where attendees earnestly discussed cosmic wisdom from the Space Brothers. Across the Atlantic, in England, George King claimed to channel an interplanetary parliament of enlightened aliens. He established the Aetherius Society in 1955, a religious movement that blended yoga, ufology, and prayers for global healing as instructed by otherworldly masters. The United States government, meanwhile, quietly kept an eye on the more influential contactees. FBI agents attended a few of their lectures in the 1950s and kept files on men like Adamski and Van Tassel, not because the agents believed in Venusian envoys, but out of concern that the movement's anti-nuclear, peace-loving rhetoric could be used as a tool of subversion in the Cold War climate. None of these cosmic prophets were found to be foreign agents. They seemed sincere in their out-of-this-world convictions. But the very fact of official surveillance underscored how significant the UFO contact movement had become. While the contactees dominated headlines with their optimistic tales, other far less comforting close encounters were quietly being reported as well. Around the world, independent of the contactee movement, ordinary people were coming forward with accounts of meeting the occupants of UFOs under bizarre and sometimes harrowing circumstances. In France, during a massive wave of sightings in 1954, dozens of individuals described small saucers landing in fields or by roadsides, and in some cases claimed that short, humanoid figures stepped out. These entities were often said to wear helmets or shiny suits and to scurry back into their craft when approached. One French railroad worker, for instance, a man named Marius de Wilde, told of being blinded by a brilliant beam from a landed saucer and seeing short, helmeted figures scurrying back into it, leaving him paralyzed and terrified as the craft shot off into the night. That same year in Italy, 2 men reported a glowing object on a remote hillside and friendly dwarf-like beings who actually exchanged gifts with them, an experience that left the men baffled and local authorities perplexed. And in perhaps the most sensational report of the era, a family on a Kentucky farm in 1955 endured a night of terror when they claimed that goblin-like creatures besieged their home after a bright object streaked overhead. According to their testimony, strange small beings with glowing eyes and spindly limbs peered into windows and even withstood gunshots as they floated around, terrifying the household for hours. The incident at Kelly Hopkinsville, as it became known, made national news and left investigators debating whether it was a hoax, a misidentified group of wild owls, or something truly unearthly. Unlike the contactee stories, these other close encounters often carried no comforting message or grand cosmic narrative. They were singular, puzzling, sometimes frightening events that left witnesses and investigators alike grasping for explanations. They suggested that if some UFOs indeed had occupants, their behavior ranged from kindly observation to apparent indifference or even hostility toward humans. Importantly, These cases were beginning to shift the image of UFO beings away from the angelic space brothers of the contactees and towards something more ambiguous, or in the Kentucky case, downright scary. Still, during the 1950s, such reports were relatively rare and did not receive the level of publicity that the well-promoted contactee adventures did. Perhaps the first hint that alien encounters could take an even darker turn came from a story that emerged, quietly, in Brazil in 1957. That year, a 23-year-old farmer named Antonio Vilas Boas stumbled home with a sensational claim. He had been abducted by the crew of a glowing egg-shaped craft while ploughing his fields at night. Vilas Boas recounted in astonishing detail how short, suited beings dragged him aboard their vehicle, took blood samples from his chin, and then introduced him to a human-like female with striking blue eyes and long white blonde hair. According to his story, he and this alien woman were compelled to engage in an intimate encounter, an experience he described with a mix of reluctance and bewilderment, after which he was released and the craft soared away. Vilas Boas later suffered mysterious symptoms, including skin burns and nausea, which some doctors noted were consistent with mild radiation exposure. At the time, his account remained confined to the files of Brazilian UFO investigators and did not reach the outside world until years later. But in retrospect, the Vilas Boas incident stands as one of the earliest claims of a forcible abduction by UFO occupants, a far cry from the friendly desert handshakes the contactees had been talking about. By the early 1960s, the era of the benevolent space brother was waning, and a new phase of UFO encounters was on the rise. And in 1961, an American couple named Betty and Barney Hill would come forward with a story of being taken aboard a strange craft against their will. A tale that would usher in the age of widespread alien abduction accounts. The Hills' disturbing account would become one of the most famous in UFO history, lending a new legitimacy to fears that perhaps not all visitors were benevolent after all. But before those darker narratives took hold, the contactee movement of the 1950s had already ensured that the UFO phenomenon was no longer just about mysterious lights in the sky. It had become a matter of human, and possibly non-human, interaction, of messages and warnings and cosmic possibilities. The first decade of the modern UFO era had ended with far more questions than answers. As the 1960s dawned, both believers and skeptics braced for what would come next. Would the sightings and encounters continue? Would the government finally pull back the curtain of secrecy? Or would the mystery only deepen? Unbeknownst to everyone, even greater revelations and challenges lay on the horizon, ensuring that the story of UFOs was far from over. By the end of the 1960s, official investigations into UFOs had wound down. Project Blue Book, the US Air Force's long-running study of the phenomenon, was terminated in 1969 after concluding that none of the sightings investigated posed a threat or revealed evidence of extraterrestrial visitors. For many, it seemed the mystery might fade away with the close of that decade. And yet, quietly and persistently, the encounters continued. In the years that followed, ordinary people would come face to face with the unknown in ways that were as astonishing as ever. The files may have been closed, but the skies, and sometimes the ground itself, still held their secrets. While countless UFO sightings involve distant lights or fleeting impressions, some experiences are far more immediate. These are the close encounters, incidents where witnesses find themselves in the presence of something utterly unconventional, at times only a stone's throw away. The term close encounter itself entered the popular lexicon around this time, reflecting a new urgency in the reports. It was no longer just about strange objects zipping through the heavens. It was about those rare moments when the phenomenon came right down to earth, confronting people in their daily lives. In hushed tones and late-night conversations, stories emerged of individuals who could never have imagined they'd be part of such a mystery, until it happened to them. On a still evening in the high desert of New Mexico, a police officer cruised along a lonely road. It was April 24th, 1964, and Officer Lonnie Zamora was pursuing a speeding driver on the outskirts of the small town of Socorro. The sun was dipping low, painting the rugged landscape in gold. Suddenly, a burst of flame and a roar caught Zamora's attention. Just off the roadside, in a shallow gully, something had flared bright. Thinking perhaps a shed or car had exploded, Zamora abandoned the chase and turned toward the smoke. As he crested a rise, he found himself looking at a scene he could scarcely believe. Nestled in the desert brush was a smooth, oval object, gleaming white in the twilight. At first glance, Zamora thought it might be an overturned car, until he noticed it had no wheels, no doors, and was standing on slender legs. The object, about the size of a car in length, rested quietly on the ground. Next to it, he glimpsed two figures. They were dressed in white coveralls and appeared surprisingly small, perhaps child-sized, though adult in shape. For an instant, the patrolman wondered if he was witnessing some kind of experimental craft with its crew. But nothing about this scene fit any ordinary explanation. Before Zamora could get much closer, the two mysterious figures seemed to notice him. They disappeared behind the craft in a sudden hurry. Moments later, a thunderous roar erupted. A bluish-orange flame shot down from the underside of the object, and the entire thing began to rise. Startled, Zamora dropped to the ground, fearing an explosion. But none came. Instead, the strange craft lifted off, drifting above the arroyo with a pulsating roar and flame. Within seconds, it gained speed and whisked away into the open sky, leaving only a trail of dust and the echo of sound rolling across the desert. When the silence finally settled back in, Zamora realized his heart was pounding. He stood up, dusted himself off, and approached the now empty site where the object had rested. The bushes were smouldering, some charred by intense heat. Impressions were gouged into the sandy soil, forming a vague landing gear pattern, evidence that something heavy had indeed pressed into the earth. Another police officer soon arrived, having heard the commotion over the radio. Together they surveyed the scene in bafflement. There was no wreckage, no obvious clue, only the scorched plants and shallow indentations marking where the craft had been. Word of Officer Zamora's encounter spread quickly. The Air Force dispatched investigators from Project Blue Book, who combed the site for any hint of an explanation. They took photographs of the landing marks and collected samples of the singed vegetation. Zamora, a well-respected, no-nonsense policeman, gave his account repeatedly to state police, Air Force personnel, and local news reporters. Each time, his story remained consistent. He described the object's oval shape, the strange insignia he thought he saw on its side, the roar of its flame, and the two small figures in white. He frankly admitted he didn't know what he had seen, only that it was unlike anything in his experience, and certainly not a prank or illusion in his eyes. Behind closed doors, the investigators were perplexed. This was not a case of a distant light or a fleeting radar blip. It was a tangible event with physical evidence and a credible witness. After extensive checks, the Blue Book team could find no records of experimental aircraft tests in the area, no college student hoaxes that fit, and no obvious mundane explanation. The object Zamora reported did not match any known aircraft or rocket. In their final report, the case was left unresolved. Project Blue Book listed the Socorro encounter as unknown, one more mystery it could not explain. It was a sobering moment. Even as Project Blue Book was winding down, it had to admit that at least one more baffling incident had slipped through its grasp. The Socorro landing became one of the most famous close encounters on record, and its details would intrigue researchers for decades. Yet it was only the beginning of a series of encounters in which humans reportedly came within arm's reach of the unknown. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, such reports did not cease. On the contrary, they seemed to become more varied, sometimes stranger, as if whatever lay behind the UFO phenomenon was testing new approaches, or as some believed, as if people were simply paying more attention than ever. Nearly a decade after Zamora's experience, on an October night in 1973, two men sat quietly fishing from an old pier along the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. The sun had long set, and the evening was calm, with only the gentle lapping of dark water against the shore. Charles Hickson, aged 42, and 19-year-old Calvin Parker often came to this spot to unwind after a day's work. They enjoyed the peace and the promise of catching a few fish under the stars. But on this night, their tranquility was about to be shattered in a way neither man could have imagined. It started with a faint whirring or buzzing sound, a mechanical drone that grew louder by the second. Looking up from the riverbank, the two men saw an odd bluish light skimming over the water. The light intensified, coalescing into a single glowing object that was approaching their position. Before they fully understood what was happening, the glow resolved into a craft hovering just a few feet above the ground, not far from where they sat. It was oval-shaped and roughly the size of a large pickup truck, with a dazzling blue-white hue emanating from its surface. Hickson and Parker were astonished and confused. Was this some kind of experimental aircraft or a divine apparition? Their minds raced, but their bodies hardly had time to react before a hatch opened on the craft. Out floated three of the strangest beings either man would ever describe. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but unlike anything in this world. Each stood about 5 feet tall, with greyish, wrinkled skin. They had no discernible eyes. In place of a normal face, the beings seemed to have an angular head with slits or openings. Their arms were long and ended in what looked like crab-like pincers. In that heart-pounding moment, both men found themselves paralyzed by fear and, as they would later attest, by something beyond fear. Parker felt a numbing wave wash over his body, a helpless sensation as if an unseen force had taken control. Hickson, though terrified, remained somewhat more alert, watching in disbelief as two of the creatures seized him. Their grip was firm, but not painful, their touch cool and strangely metallic, like the smooth surface of a machine. The third entity moved toward Parker. Though he wanted to run, Parker found he could not. Both men felt themselves lifted off the ground. Charles Hickson could barely process what was happening as he was carried toward the hovering craft. An opening beckoned, spilling brilliant light onto the riverbank. He was floated into a chamber and placed in a reclined position, as if for examination. Though panic swirled inside him, Hickson noticed that his fear was oddly blunted. Perhaps by shock, or by some influence of the environment, he couldn't be sure. One of the beings hovered a small, eye-like device around him, scanning his body with an eerie thoroughness. Hickson couldn't move or speak. He could only lie there in a kind of dazed astonishment at this bizarre examination. Across the way, Calvin Parker was in a state of near hysteria. Later in life, Parker would say that he prayed fervently during the ordeal, believing he might not survive it. He recalled being examined by a similar floating device. Although his memories were less clear than Hickson's, the sheer terror of the experience seared itself into his mind. In a matter of minutes, though to the two men it felt much longer, they were suddenly deposited back on the riverbank, trembling and disoriented. The craft that had taken them was gone. It vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived, shooting off into the night sky and leaving the two fishermen alone under the stars once more. For a long moment, Hickson and Parker struggled to gather their wits. Parker was in tears, nearly catatonic with shock, his body shaking uncontrollably. Hickson, though deeply shaken, tried to steady himself and think clearly. They knew they had experienced something utterly extraordinary, but what could they do with that knowledge? In 1973 Mississippi, telling such a story risked ridicule and disbelief. Yet as they talked it over, they realized they needed to report what happened, if only to ensure that if anyone else had seen something in the area, the authorities would know it wasn't a prank. That night, they approached the local sheriff's office. At first, the deputies and sheriff listened with skepticism. Two men claiming that strange creatures had pulled them aboard a UFO sounded like the stuff of science fiction or a wild hoax. The officers took their initial statements with polite disbelief. To test the story, the sheriff left Hickson and Parker alone in a room secretly wired to record their private conversation. If this were a hoax, the men might drop their act once alone. Instead, the tape captured something else entirely. The two continued talking in panicked whispers about what they had seen, wondering if the beings might return. Hickson can be heard trying to calm Parker, who kept praying and sobbing. The raw fear and confusion on that recording convinced the sheriff that whatever had happened, these men were not making it up for attention. In the days that followed, the press got hold of the story. The Pascagoula encounter, as it came to be known, became national news. Suddenly, Hickson and Parker found themselves at the center of curiosity and controversy. US Navy investigators interviewed them, and both men later took polygraph exams in hopes of proving their honesty. Hickson passed a lie detector test, further supporting his sincerity. Parker, who was younger and more traumatized, had difficulty with the testing, but he never wavered in his account. Over the years, as they retold their experience, their story remained fundamentally consistent. Decades later, Parker, who had long avoided publicity, would even write a detailed book about that night, standing by every word of his astonishing tale. The Pascagoula incident remains one of the most startling close encounter cases on record. It highlighted a dimension of the UFO mystery that went beyond lights in the sky. If Hickson and Parker's story was to be believed, it meant not only that an unknown craft had come extremely close to two ordinary people, but that some kind of entities were involved. Entities that seemed to show interest in human beings, even if only to examine them briefly. For those two men on the riverbank, there was life before that night, and life after, and they were not the same. Their experience left them shaken for years to come, with Parker especially having difficulty coping with the trauma of that encounter. As word of such encounters spread through the 1970s, a pattern began to emerge. Occasionally, individuals or groups reported experiences that were not just sightings of something strange at a distance, but direct, up-close interactions. Each story was unique, yet they all shared an aura of the deeply mysterious. Often there were common threads: the silence of the craft, the odd effects on witnesses like paralysis or missing time, the nagging question of why them. People in quiet towns and remote areas suddenly found themselves at the heart of an unsolved riddle, one that even government agencies, if they were paying attention, had no easy answers for. Another such encounter took place in the thickly wooded mountains of Arizona in 1975. This time, The witnesses were a group of 7 forestry workers, rugged young men used to the outdoors. Just before sunset on November 5th, 1975, after a long day cutting trees in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, the crew piled into their truck to head back home. Among them was a 22-year-old named Travis Walton, known to his friends as a strong-willed young man who loved adventure. Little did Walton know that he was about to become the center of one of the most famous and controversial close encounter cases of all time. As the pickup truck wound down the dirt road through the forest, the men noticed a bright light filtering through the trees ahead. At first they thought it might be a fire, perhaps a plane crash, or a small forest fire glowing against the twilight sky. Curiosity and concern led them to drive closer. What they saw next made them stop the truck and stare in disbelief. Hovering not far above a clearing was a luminous object unlike anything they had seen before. It was described later as a disc-shaped craft, glowing with a strange, vibrant blue-green light and emitting a high-pitched mechanical whir that the men could feel in their chests. Travis Walton, seated by a window, was captivated. Against the shouted warnings of his friends, Travis leapt out of the truck and moved toward the hovering saucer. In that moment, he was both frightened and exhilarated, drawn by sheer astonishment and the urge to understand what he was seeing. He approached the craft slowly, craning his neck to take in its full form above him. The air felt charged, as if electrified by the object's presence. His co-workers continued to yell for him to get back in the truck, sensing danger. But Travis kept moving, stepping directly beneath the mysterious craft's glow. What happened in the next instant is something the crew would recount over and over with trembling voices. A brilliant blue beam of light suddenly shot from the underside of the craft and struck Travis squarely. It was as if a bolt of lightning had erupted from the ship, except it made no thunder. Travis's body stiffened and then was lifted clear off the ground, thrown back by the force of the ray. He landed hard a few yards away and lay eerily still. Panicking, the crew in the truck believed they had just seen their friend killed or horribly injured by whatever that beam was. In a surge of terror, the driver started the engine and sped away, leaving Travis behind. As they hurtled down the rough track, the men in the truck were in chaos, shouting, some in tears, all in shock at what they had witnessed. Within minutes, guilt and concern got the better of the driver, and he decided they had to go back for Travis, no matter the risk. Gathering their courage, the crew turned around and returned to the clearing. But when they arrived, the clearing was empty. The strange craft was gone, and Travis Walton was nowhere to be seen. They called out his name and searched around in the darkness with flashlights. Nothing. It was as if the woods had swallowed him up, leaving only the silent trees as witnesses. The disappearance of Travis Walton set off a massive search and a flurry of investigations. The local sheriff's office was notified, and soon search parties with dogs combed the forest. Given the extraordinary story told by the 6 remaining crew members, law enforcement initially considered the possibility that Travis had been injured or even killed by the men in some accident or altercation. After all, their claim that a flying saucer had struck him down sounded unbelievable. But the men stuck to their account, even when questioned separately. They were distraught and earnest, with a couple of them visibly traumatized by the incident. In the small community, whispers spread that maybe these loggers had concocted an elaborate cover story to hide some misdeed. Yet no trace of Travis, no blood, no clothing, no sign of an injured man wandering, could be found in that wilderness. After 5 long days and nights, a phone rang at the home of Travis Walton's brother-in-law in the middle of the night. On the other end was a voice, weak and frightened, saying it was Travis. He was alive and nearby, found disoriented at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Family members rushed to pick him up. Travis was dazed, physically unharmed for the most part, but emotionally fragile and confused. He thought only a few hours had passed since that fateful moment in the woods. In reality, he had been gone for nearly a week. As the realization sank in, so did the incredible story that Travis began to tell about what happened to him during those missing days. In the days and weeks that followed, Travis Walton recounted through interviews a narrative that sounded like science fiction. He described regaining consciousness in a strange room, lying on a flat surface. Above him was a light, and around him stood beings that were not human. They resembled the archetypal greys of later UFO lore, short, with large eyes and smooth, hairless heads. Travis panicked and tried to fight them off, managing to stand and grab a rod-like object from a shelf to defend himself. The beings left the room, and Travis explored the corridors of what he perceived to be a spacecraft, at one point encountering human-looking individuals in blue suits who escorted him and placed a mask over his face. His next memory was of waking up on the roadside, seeing a craft depart into the sky, and then stumbling to a phone to call for help. Much like the Pascagoula case, the Walton incident polarized public opinion. Some believed Travis completely, citing the corroborative accounts of his co-workers and the initial polygraph results. Others were skeptical, including a few investigators who thought there were inconsistencies or suspected a hoax or hallucination. Yet to this day, Travis Walton stands by his story, and several of the crew maintain that what they saw was real and not of this earth. No conclusive evidence ever emerged to prove a hoax, and the case remains a landmark in UFO history. It was even dramatized in a Hollywood film years later, bringing the eerie encounter to a wide audience. These close encounters, whether the Socorro landing, the Pascagoula abduction, the Travis Walton incident, or numerous quieter cases known only in small communities, add a deeply human dimension to the UFO mystery. It is one thing to see strange lights in the sky, and quite another to stand close enough to touch a mysterious craft, or to come face to face with entities that defy everything we know. Each such story comes with people whose lives are forever changed, who often wish for nothing more than to return to normalcy, yet feel compelled to share what happened because it was so profoundly out of the ordinary. Their voices, shaking and sincere, echo in the records of declassified reports and personal testimonies. And though skeptics may question details or offer theories, the sense of wonder and fear that these witnesses experienced is unmistakable. As we leave behind these personal tales of contact, one might ask, are these isolated incidents or part of a larger pattern? Do they hint at a purpose behind the UFO phenomenon, or are they simply rare, bizarre accidents of fate? Those questions lingered in the minds of many as the 1970s wore on. Beyond the individuals who stood alone in the presence of the unknown, there were others who encountered mysteries together, in groups, and even with the aid of technology. Indeed, some of the most compelling UFO incidents on record involve multiple witnesses and even the cold, hard corroboration of radar screens and cameras. It is to those cases, the ones where the unknown made itself known to many at once, that we turn next. In the realm of UFO sightings, the power of a single witness's testimony can be profound. But when multiple people, sometimes dozens or even hundreds, see the same thing, and when machines and instruments also pick up the anomaly, the events take on an even more undeniable quality. Such cases stand out in the archives, stamped not just with personal accounts, but with radar readings, photographs, and recordings. They are the multi-witness events and radar-confirmed incidents that suggest whatever is in our skies can be observed, tracked, and even chased, though not always caught. As the phenomenon persisted into the 1970s, these collective encounters provided some of the most compelling evidence that something unexplained was moving through our world, paying little heed to borders or to the watchful eyes of human technology. One landmark case in UFO history unfolded in the summer of 1952, not long after the phenomenon first captured widespread attention. For several tense nights in July of that year, the skies over the United States Capitol were alive with mysterious activity. Air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport stared in disbelief as bright blips appeared on their radar screens, darting across the scope at unimaginable speeds. At the same time, on those humid evenings, airline pilots flying near Washington, D.C. reported strange lights streaking through the sky, and citizens on the ground gazed upward at glowing objects moving in eerie silence. The nation's capital, perhaps the most heavily monitored airspace in the world, had unwelcome visitors. The first incidents occurred shortly after sunset on a Saturday night. Controllers initially thought their radar might be malfunctioning when a cluster of unidentified targets showed up where no aircraft should have been. These objects were not following any flight paths or obeying the normal rules of the sky. They zigzagged, reversed course in an instant, and clocked velocities far beyond the capabilities of the jets of the era. When one controller confirmed the contacts, others crowded in to see for themselves, verifying the mysterious echoes. Soon, the sightings were not just electronic. Pilots approaching Washington saw odd lights closing in on their planes before peeling away at fantastic speed. At Andrews Air Force Base nearby, personnel visually confirmed hovering orange and white lights that corresponded to what the radars were showing. The region's calm summer night was becoming something extraordinary. Authorities responded quickly. Fighters were scrambled into the muggy Washington skies in an attempt to intercept the unknown intruders. Pilots roared into the darkness, guided by ground controllers toward the dancing targets. Yet each time an interceptor drew close, the objects would vanish from both radar and the pilot's sight, only to reappear elsewhere moments later, as if playing a high-tech game of cat and mouse. One jet pilot did catch a fleeting glimpse of a bright light speeding away, but he could not close the distance. These dramatic pursuits played out over 2 consecutive weekends, causing a media sensation. Headlines around the world declared that UFOs had swarmed over the White House and Capitol building, fueling speculation and public anxiety. The US Air Force, inundated with questions, held a major press conference to address the Washington incidents. Under hot lights and flashbulbs, the Air Force's top brass offered a cautious explanation. Perhaps it was all a case of mistaken radar readings caused by a temperature inversion, a weather condition that can create mirages on radar. They suggested that nervous operators and imaginative observers had misinterpreted stars or meteors. To many, this explanation rang hollow, especially to those who had seen the objects with their own eyes or tracked them on multiple radar sets. Regardless, the events of July 1952 left a deep impression. In private memos, intelligence officials called the sightings puzzling and noted the high credibility of the witnesses. The files from that time show an Air Force struggling to reassure the public, while, behind the scenes, recognizing that something unknown had penetrated the skies above the nation's capital. As the decades went on, other mass sightings would similarly grip communities and baffle authorities. Not all received the same level of publicity, but each added to the growing record. Across the ocean in 1956, at a US airbase in England, multiple military radar stations and an airborne crew tracked a fast-moving object that outmaneuvered RAF fighter jets, a case that remains unexplained in official annals. In 1965, hundreds of people in and around Exeter, New Hampshire, watched a large glowing object hover and dart about. Police officers and civilians alike gave corroborating reports that made headlines and later detailed entries in Project Blue Book's files. Around the world, it seemed that whenever groups of people looked up together in wonder or fear, the phenomenon was there too, as real to them as anything else in the sky. One of the most striking multi-witness encounters occurred far from America or Europe, in a country that at the time rarely made Western headlines, except for its ancient history. In the early hours of September 19th, 1976, residents of Tehran, the capital of Iran, saw a radiant object hovering in the dark sky. Calls poured in to local authorities about a bright light, like a star intensified, moving oddly overhead. The Imperial Iranian Air Force sprang into action, scrambling two F-4 Phantom II jet interceptors to investigate what was initially assumed to be a misidentified civilian aircraft, or perhaps a spy plane. What transpired in the skies over Tehran would become one of the most thoroughly documented and baffling aerial encounters on record. The first jet screamed into the night, making its approach toward the hovering intruder. As the pilot drew nearer to the object, a glowing mass of multicolored lights, his jet suddenly lost all radio and instrument functionality. The cockpit went dark. Every dial dropped to zero. Surprised and alarmed, he broke off his pursuit. Only when he turned back did his controls flicker to life again, as if whatever force had disabled them was tied to the mysterious craft. Back on the ground, commanders quickly dispatched a second F-4, this time piloted by a squadron leader, Major Parviz Jafari. As Jafari thundered upward, he could already see the pulsating brilliance of the unknown object lighting up the sky ahead. It was unlike any aircraft he knew. Its lights flashed in rapid sequences of blue, green, red, and orange, and it moved with astonishing agility. Closing in at high speed, Jafari's radar locked onto the object, indicating that something solid was indeed out there ahead of him. According to his instruments, it was comparable in size to a large tanker aircraft, yet it exhibited a nimbleness no tanker could manage. Suddenly, as he got within a few dozen miles, the unthinkable happened. The object seemed to react. A smaller, bright orb broke away from the main UFO and shot directly toward Jafari's fighter. In that instant, the hunter became the hunted. Fearing an attack, the pilot prepared to fire an AIM-9 Sidewinder missile in self-defense. But at that critical moment, his weapons panel went dead and his communications fell silent. His missile system refused to respond. In the eerie quiet of his disabled cockpit, Jafari watched with mounting concern as the smaller orb rapidly closed the distance, only to abruptly halt and then circle away at high speed. It returned to the larger object, which itself then began to move, as if demonstrating that it could leave whenever it wished. With his jet's functions gradually returning, the shaken pilot was ordered to disengage and return to base. On his way back, Jafari noticed something else remarkable. Another object, a small glowing orb, had apparently descended from the main craft toward the ground. It illuminated the desert floor softly as it went down, as if it might have landed. Air traffic control and Jafari both marked the coordinates. After dawn, a helicopter was sent to investigate that area. They found nothing definitive. Some reports mentioned a circular patch on the ground, but the memory of that night remained vivid for all involved. The Iranian incident was swiftly communicated to US officials. An intelligence report later summarized the encounter, noting the multiple confirmations and the unexplained equipment failures. It concluded that this case was a classic example of a UFO sighting, remarkable for its high reliability and for the extraordinary capabilities demonstrated by the object. Decades later, Major Jafari would still recount the events with conviction, insisting that what he chased that night was not any known aircraft or phenomenon. These radar and multi-witness cases bolstered the credibility of the UFO phenomenon in the eyes of many. It wasn't just solitary people in remote areas having uncanny experiences. It was also trained observers like pilots, radar operators, and entire groups of unrelated witnesses confirming something real and unexplainable in their midst. Another example came in late December 1978 along the remote southern coast of New Zealand. A cargo aircraft flying a night route became the center of a mysterious encounter when the crew noticed bright lights maneuvering around them. Air traffic control in Wellington detected unknown targets on radar at the same time. The objects would appear on the radar screen, vanish, and then reappear in a different location, much like the game of chase played out decades earlier over Washington, D.C. One of the crew on board was a television cameraman who managed to capture a few minutes of the bizarre lights on film. The footage, though grainy, showed luminous orbs that defied easy explanation. The Kaikoura lights, as they became known, after the nearby Kaikoura range and coast, left investigators scratching their heads. Explanations ranged from reflections to lights from squid boats, but to the pilots and radar staff involved, the coordination of the sightings and readings was unforgettable. From the 1950s through the 1970s, the pattern repeated. Whenever unidentified objects manifested with enough drama to be seen by many, some form of detection often backed up the stories. Sometimes it was radar confirming what eyewitnesses swore they saw. Other times, photographs were taken that later analysis could not fully debunk. In a few cases, sounds were recorded or physical traces, like indented soil or burned foliage, were found, as in Socorro years earlier. Each piece of evidence added weight to the notion that these were real events occurring in the physical world, not just in the minds of observers. For those who pored over newly released documents in later years, these multi-witness encounters stood out as especially hard to dismiss. Of course, even compelling evidence can raise questions rather than provide answers. Radar blips and photographs by themselves don't reveal the nature or origin of the objects. The Washington, D.C. sightings led to no captured craft or final explanation, despite the radars and jets. The Tehran encounter, astonishing as it was, ended with the UFO departing into the unknown, leaving behind only confused pilots and intrigued intelligence officers. And the New Zealand lights yielded a tantalizing film and curious radar logs, but no definitive identification. Still, for the investigators and the public who learned of these incidents, they underscored a crucial point. Whatever UFOs were, they could be observed by multiple independent means. The phenomenon was not just in the eye of the beholder. It could leave tracks on the very instruments designed to make sense of the skies. As the 1970s progressed, those tasked with defending the skies had to contend with an uncomfortable reality. Time and again, they were encountering objects they could neither catch nor comprehend. Nowhere was this more unsettling than when those unknown intruders appeared over the most sensitive locations of all, military bases and installations. After exploring cases where many eyes and ears confirmed the presence of the unknown, we now turn to those incidents that unfolded over restricted, strategic sites. Here, UFOs not only made their presence known, but sometimes engaged in what seemed like brazen surveillance or even interference, leaving those in charge of national security both alarmed and amazed. From the earliest days of the UFO mystery, a curious and disquieting pattern emerged. Time and again, these unexplained objects showed a particular interest in humanity's engines of war and defense. Military bases, especially those housing the most sensitive weapons, often found themselves unwelcome hosts to enigmatic visitors. Declassified files from various countries have revealed that what was dismissed publicly as nonsense was, behind closed doors, sometimes a matter of urgent concern. To those standing guard on lonely perimeters or monitoring radar screens late at night, the appearance of a silent, hovering light over a nuclear missile silo or the sudden interference with communications could mark the start of a very long evening. In fact, as far back as the late 1940s, US military sites experienced unexplained aerial incursions. In New Mexico, where top-secret research and atomic tests were conducted, fiery green balls of light were repeatedly seen streaking through the sky. Security personnel at the Los Alamos and Sandia laboratories, birthplaces of the atomic bomb, reported these eerily consistent green fireballs on numerous occasions. Scientists were brought in to investigate. Some initially suspected Soviet spy devices, while others thought perhaps a rare natural phenomenon. Despite deploying special cameras and radars in a project codenamed Twinkle, the green fireballs defied a clear explanation and eventually faded from prominence, leaving behind an unsettling question. Who or what was so interested in the nation's nuclear secrets? That question would resurface dramatically in the 1960s. By then, the Cold War was at its height, and both superpowers maintained fields of intercontinental ballistic missiles ready, in theory, to unleash unimaginable destruction. On a cold morning in March 1967, at a remote Air Force facility in Montana, something occurred that remains difficult to fully grasp even decades later. Malmstrom Air Force Base was a linchpin of America's strategic missile defense, with multiple underground silos housing Minuteman nuclear missiles scattered across the plains. In the pre-dawn hours, reports began coming in from security guards out in the missile fields. A glowing red object, like a fiery disk, was silently hovering near one of the silo gates. The guards, trained observers, were alarmed. They described the object as unlike any helicopter or aircraft they knew. Brilliant, disc-shaped, and soundless, except perhaps for a faint hum. Deep below ground, in a reinforced launch control center, Air Force officers monitoring the missiles received an urgent call from the guards topside. Even as they tried to make sense of the situation, indicators on their control panels began to flash. One by one, in rapid succession, several missiles in their charge went into a no-go condition, essentially disabling themselves. These were missiles kept independently in hardened silos, each with separate systems. Yet something had affected them all at once. The officers, stunned, went through their checklists. It was as if a key part of each missile's guidance or power system had mysteriously failed. To shut down one missile was rare. To shut down a whole group simultaneously was unheard of. As technicians scrambled to figure out what had happened, the strange craft outside reportedly rose and departed, climbing high and disappearing at incredible speed. In the aftermath, emergency crews inspected the silos and systems. The missiles were eventually brought back online, but the cause of the shutdowns was never definitively identified. An internal investigation was launched. Engineers could find no ordinary electrical or mechanical fault that would explain the incident. Those present who knew about the UFO hovering at the time could only draw one chilling inference. Whatever that object was, it had the ability to tamper with the most advanced weapons technology the Air Force possessed. For years, this story remained buried in classified reports and in the memories of those involved. Only later, through personal accounts and some declassified documents, did the Malmstrom case come to light. And as astonishing as it was, it proved not to be an isolated incident. The late 1960s and 1970s saw a string of encounters at military installations that followed a similar script. Unknown lights or craft appear in restricted airspace, and suddenly sensitive equipment goes haywire. In late 1975, a wave of such intrusions swept across North America. At Loring Air Force Base in Maine, a site housing nuclear weapons, security personnel on October nights observed an unidentified craft with a bright light hovering just outside the facility's boundaries. It resembled a helicopter with a spotlight, yet it moved in uncanny silence and evaded attempts to intercept it. Over the next weeks, similar reports came from Malmstrom in Montana, again, Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, Wurtsmith in Michigan, and even from Canadian forces at Falconbridge in Ontario. Security police and radar operators alike were witnessing unknown aerial intruders over nuclear storage areas and missile silos. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Internal communications from that time, later obtained through Freedom of Information requests, show senior officials grappling with these events. While the public heard nothing of these incursions, memos flew between Air Force commands. Descriptions of mystery helicopters or unidentified aircraft at low altitude in sensitive areas peppered the reports. In one instance, the intruder's speed and maneuverability far outmatched any helicopter, leading base commanders to doubt the initial label, even as they used it for convenience. The concern in these documents is palpable. Could it be espionage by a foreign power, testing US defenses? Or was it something else entirely? One account mentioned a craft that could hover silently and then accelerate vertically at tremendous speed, leaving pursuing jets far behind, qualities found in no known technology of the time. Even as they documented these encounters with puzzlement, the military's official stance to the public remained dismissive of UFOs. But on the inside, these base incidents clearly rattled those charged with security. If unknown objects could infiltrate the most secure nuclear sites with impunity, what did that imply about control and preparedness? The phenomenon wasn't confined to the United States. Across the ocean, in the Soviet Union, there were whispers and later reports of similar happenings. Details only emerged years afterward, but Soviet personnel too had sightings of strange craft near their missile bases. Some former Soviet military officials recounted an incident in the late 1970s where a bright object hovered over a base, and incredibly, the launch systems of some missiles briefly activated as if preparing to fire, sending crews into panic before the object departed and the systems returned to normal. Such stories, whether in the East or West, underscored a sobering possibility. These unknown intruders, whoever or whatever they were, had an interest in humanity's most destructive devices and potentially the capability to toy with them. Not every encounter at a military site involved nuclear arms, however. UFOs have been reported over airfields, training ranges, and other installations as well, sometimes engaging in what looked like surveillance of routine military activities. In one account from the 1960s, a US Air Force officer in California claimed that during a test of a ballistic missile, a high-speed craft was caught on film approaching the missile mid-flight and somehow interfering with its warhead. An incident so startling that the footage was allegedly classified and whisked away. While skeptics question such tales, they tend to be corroborated by multiple witnesses who have little to gain by coming forward. Often, they speak out only years or decades later, motivated by a sense of duty or a desire for truth. Perhaps the most dramatic military base encounter of that era was yet to come, just at the close of the 1970s. At an Air Force base in England, jointly used by American forces, a handful of security personnel would soon have an experience that seemed straight out of a science fiction film. Lights in the forest, a landed craft, and bizarre physical evidence left behind, all within sight of the base's perimeter. That incident, kept quiet at the time, would later become one of the most famous in UFO lore, and a key case in the argument that whatever these objects were, They weren't just random lights in the sky. But as the 1970s drew to an end, it was clear from the pattern of incidents up to that point that military forces around the world had been inadvertently drawn into a cat-and-mouse game with the unknown. The files and testimonies from encounters over military bases reveal an interesting irony. These sites, filled with the most advanced technology and weaponry humans have devised, were seemingly vulnerable to incursions by something that, at least in these instances, showed no hostile action beyond demonstration. It was as if the UFOs were making a point, moving with impunity where they were least expected, perhaps sending a message to those in command. What that message might be, warning, intimidation, curiosity, was anyone's guess. For the officers on duty during these events, the feelings ranged from awe to dread. A guard staring up at a glowing disc hovering over a missile silo had to wonder what its intention was. A pilot in a ready room, hearing the call to scramble because an intruder had been seen above the base, had to leap into his jet, knowing this was no ordinary drill. These were nights when the unknown directly challenged the systems meant to keep nations safe. And though no shots were fired, and no overt aggression occurred, the implications were enough to keep commanders awake long after the objects vanished. After each incident, normalcy eventually returned. The missiles were brought back online. The security alerts were stood down. Reports were written and filed away, often stamped secret, and sometimes officially dismissed with a shrug. Yet for those who were there, something fundamental had changed. They had seen, on radar screens or with their own eyes, a breach of the presumed order of things. The sky above bases, usually the realm of routine training flights, stars, and the occasional wandering aircraft, had become the stage for unscripted encounters with the extraordinary. Having examined these disquieting events, we see that UFOs were not just a matter of personal curiosity or fringe speculation for the military. They were a practical, if elusive, concern. The phenomenon did not discriminate. It engaged both civilian and soldier, appearing over city streets and forbidden military zones alike. Nowhere is this more evident than in the accounts of pilots themselves. Whether chasing UFOs or sometimes being chased by them, pilot witnesses add another authoritative layer to this mystery. Across the world, highly trained men and women in the cockpit have come forward with astonishing stories of encounters in the sky. To their experiences we will next turn, as our journey through these declassified mysteries continues. High above the earth, in the cockpit of an airplane, the world below fades away, and the sky becomes an endless frontier. Pilots know this domain intimately. They trust their senses and instruments with their lives, trained to distinguish the ordinary from the extraordinary. So when a pilot comes forward with a report of a UFO, it carries a special weight. These are not casual observers. They are professionals, accustomed to judging distances, speeds, and lights in the sky. Over the decades, pilots from many nations, flying everything from small single-engine planes to massive airliners and high-performance military jets, have encountered objects that defied their understanding. Their testimonies, delivered in calm, matter-of-fact tones, often read like something out of a thriller. But for these airmen and women, the encounters were all too real. The history of pilots seeing the unexplained goes back at least to World War II. During late-night missions, Allied pilots reported curious Foo Fighters, glowing orbs that would suddenly appear and dance around their aircraft, pacing them or making impossible turns before zipping away. At first, Allied crews thought the orbs might be secret German weapons, until they learned that German pilots saw them too and suspected they were Allied devices. In truth, nobody on either side could catch or explain these lights that haunted the wartime skies. They never interfered directly, but their presence was an eerie reminder that even in humanity's fiercest conflict, there were other mysteries at play in the air. Not long after the war, in the summer of 1947, a civilian pilot named Kenneth Arnold gave the modern phenomenon its most famous nickname. As mentioned earlier, Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier when he saw a formation of 9 shimmering objects flitting between mountain peaks at incredible speed. He later described their motion as being like a saucer if you skip it across water, which the press turned into the term flying saucers. Arnold's account was significant not only for launching a pop culture sensation, but because it came from a man considered a skilled observer of the sky. It wasn't a farmer or a city dweller who first made international news with a UFO sighting. It was a pilot, someone with a trained eye and a reputation to uphold. As the years went by, many other pilots would have their own extraordinary sightings. On a clear night in July 1948, 2 veteran commercial pilots, Captain Childs and co-pilot John Whitted of Eastern Airlines, were flying a DC-3 passenger plane over Alabama. Without warning, a brilliant, torpedo-shaped craft appeared directly ahead of them. The object had 2 rows of windows along its side and glowed with an intense bluish-white light. Childs quickly banked to avoid a collision as the object streaked by at tremendous speed before shooting upward and vanishing. Both pilots gave detailed written reports of what they had seen, and a passenger on the flight caught a brief glimpse as well. The Air Force investigated this Childs-Whitted incident as part of Project Sign, and even considered whether it might have been a secret Soviet rocket or an extraterrestrial craft. In the end, the case was left without a satisfying explanation, eventually written off by some as a particularly vivid meteor, a conclusion the pilots themselves firmly rejected. They knew they hadn't seen a meteor. As Captain Childs insisted, they had nearly been hit by a solid, wingless, cigar-shaped machine under intelligent control. Only 6 months later, in January 1948, a Kentucky Air National Guard pilot named Captain Thomas Mantell tragically lost his life in an encounter with the unknown. Mantell was chasing a large metallic object reported in the skies near Fort Knox. Witnesses on the ground described the UFO as huge and round, gleaming in the daylight. Determined to identify it, Mantell climbed higher and higher in his F-51 Mustang, beyond the altitude where he should have been using an oxygen mask. He likely blacked out from lack of oxygen, and his plane ultimately crashed. At the time, newspapers speculated Mantell might have died pursuing a spaceship. The official explanation later was that he had probably been chasing the planet Venus, or perhaps a secret balloon, and simply pushed his aircraft too far. Yet, whatever the cause, Mantell became the first pilot known to have died during a UFO encounter. His final words included a description of the object as metallic and tremendous in size. The incident left a lingering cautionary tale among pilots about the potential perils of engaging the unknown. As commercial air travel expanded in the 1950s and 1960s, so did pilot encounters. Sightings came from every corner of the globe. Many went unpublicized, often because pilots feared ridicule or career repercussions for reporting something so unusual. But some reports did emerge, and even reached official channels. Japanese airline crews in the 1950s logged encounters with peculiar lights, pacing their planes at night over the Pacific. In one case, a veteran captain recounted multiple white lights performing abrupt maneuvers around his aircraft, noting that his onboard radar briefly picked them up too. Across the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, military aviators had their own whispered accounts of unidentified targets that would appear on intercept missions, flying far faster or higher than any known plane. Such stories rarely reached the public at the time, but after the Cold War, a number of former Soviet pilots and officials described incidents where their fighters were scrambled to chase luminous spheres or disc-shaped craft intruding into their airspace. The pattern sounded very similar to what their counterparts in the West were experiencing. One of the most haunting pilot encounters on record occurred in 1978 over the Bass Strait, the channel of sea between mainland Australia and Tasmania. Frederick Valentich was a 20-year-old private pilot on a nighttime training flight in a single-engine Cessna. On October 21st, as dusk turned to darkness, Valentich radioed Melbourne Air Traffic Control to report something unusual. He described an unidentified craft flying near him. At first he thought it might be another aircraft, but its speed and movements didn't match any known plane. It passed over him at high velocity. He reported it had a shiny metallic surface and a green light, and that it seemed to be playing some kind of game with him, flying around him at high speed. The controller told Valentich there was no known traffic in his vicinity. As minutes went by, the situation grew more tense. Valentich's transmissions came through with audible strain in his voice. He exclaimed that the mysterious craft was hovering and not an aircraft. His final transmission was cut off by a loud metallic noise. "It's not an aircraft," he managed to say, and then radio contact was lost. When Valentich failed to arrive at his destination, a search and rescue operation was launched, but no trace of him or his plane was ever found. The Valentich disappearance remains one of aviation's great mysteries. It left Australia shaken and made headlines worldwide. Some speculated he became disoriented, or that it was a hoax, but the timing of his frightened reports and later witnesses on the ground, who reported seeing an odd green light in the sky that night, suggests something extraordinary occurred. To this day, Valentich's fate is unknown, and his last words continue to haunt anyone who hears the recording. Around the same time, Europe was not without its own dramatic encounters. In November 1979, a commercial flight operated by Spain's TAE airline found itself at the center of a historic UFO incident. The plane, a Caravelle jet with over 100 passengers on board, was cruising on a calm night toward the Spanish mainland when the flight crew noticed a set of intense red lights closing in at high speed. The lights seemed to position themselves dangerously near the airliner, causing the captain, a veteran pilot, to worry about a mid-air collision. After attempting and failing to make radio contact with what he assumed must be another aircraft, though none was scheduled to be there, he made a critical decision for safety. He diverted the flight and made an emergency landing at Valencia's Manises airport to get his passengers out of harm's way. It was reportedly the first time a commercial airliner had made an emergency landing due to a UFO. The drama didn't end there. Spanish Air Force authorities, now alerted to a potential unknown object in a busy air corridor, scrambled a Mirage fighter jet to investigate the intruder that had forced the landing. The fighter's pilot, who later gave a detailed report, chased a bright object that he described as having a cone shape and a vivid red glow. At one point, he managed to lock his radar onto it, confirming that something solid was really there. But each time he closed in, the object accelerated away with astonishing speed, far exceeding his jet's capabilities. The cat-and-mouse pursuit continued until the mysterious craft rose high and vanished over the sea. The incident, now known as the Manises UFO encounter, was taken seriously by Spanish authorities, who conducted an official inquiry. It remains one of Europe's most significant aviation incidents, involving an unidentified flying object, one in which both civilian and military pilots played a key role. Across the globe, similar stories echo one another. A British Overseas Airways Corporation crew over the Atlantic in 1954 watched as metallic disc-shaped objects danced in formation off their wingtip. An Iranian Air Force pilot in 1976, as we recounted earlier over Tehran, tried to engage a UFO and experienced a cockpit full of dead instruments, a tale as harrowing as it is well documented. In the 1980s, a Soviet MiG pilot reportedly fired at a speeding orb that had intruded over a base, only to see the orb emerge unscathed and dart off into the stars. Time and again, people whose job is to navigate the sky safely have thrown up their hands and admitted, something truly strange was out there with us. Perhaps some of the most striking endorsements of the UFO reality have come from astronauts, individuals who have left Earth entirely and gazed back at the blue marble from orbit. They are not prone to flights of fancy. Colonel Gordon Cooper, one of America's original Mercury astronauts, was also an elite test pilot. He claimed that during his Air Force days, he saw a saucer-shaped craft land at Edwards Air Force Base, and even had film footage of the event. According to Cooper, that footage was swiftly sent off to Washington, and he never saw it again. Later in life, Cooper spoke openly about his belief that UFOs were real physical vehicles, possibly from beyond Earth, and that governments were hiding what they knew. He even addressed a United Nations panel in 1978, urging world leaders to take the phenomenon seriously. Another astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, did not claim to have seen a UFO himself, but he repeatedly stated after retiring from NASA that he was convinced by insider testimony that an extraterrestrial presence was engaging humanity. When people of such caliber and experience weigh in, it becomes harder for skeptics to wave away all UFO reports as misidentifications or delusions. For pilots and astronauts, reporting a UFO has often come with risks to career and reputation. Many have chosen to keep their experiences quiet, sharing details only with close colleagues or family. And yet the accounts have accumulated, quietly and consistently, across the world. French fighter pilots, Chilean Air Force majors, South African airmen, Indian commercial captains, you name the country, and you can find a story of someone up in the sky encountering the unknown. The descriptions often align: disc-like shapes, cigar-like craft, bright spheres of light, movements that defy inertia, the ability to accelerate instantly or to hover without visible means of lift. These characteristics repeat from case to case, as if whoever or whatever is behind them has a playbook they rarely deviate from. Hearing a pilot calmly recount such an encounter can be surreal. Pilots tend to understate. They speak in technical terms, even when describing something extraordinary. They'll mention how an object executed a sharp turn with an angle of bank that would be impossible for a conventional aircraft, or how it accelerated from Mach 0.8 to well beyond Mach 2 in the blink of an eye. Beneath that cool delivery, however, one can sense the lingering astonishment. These individuals were going about their normal flights, a routine patrol, a nightly cargo run, a passenger hop across the sea, when suddenly they were thrust into an unscheduled rendezvous with the inexplicable. As we reflect on these pilot testimonies, it becomes clear that UFOs have not only been a curiosity for ground observers, but a very real factor in aviation. To this day, flight crews occasionally report unidentified objects, and air traffic controllers add notes to logs about radar targets that come and go with no transponder or known flight plan, while organizations and governments have sometimes quietly collected such reports. Open acknowledgement has been rare. Still, the skies have their own chronicles. Through those who traverse them, we have a story of fleeting meetings with something beyond our current understanding. And as fascinating and mystifying as those stories are, they also serve as a prelude. When numerous encounters happen in a short span, a wave of sightings that sweeps across regions, the mystery takes on a broader scope. In the 1970s, one such period of intense activity unfolded, gripping the attention of the public and officials alike. It is to that remarkable wave and its impact that we turn next. Early in the decade, reports ticked along steadily, but by 1973, a notable spike occurred. That year brought an extraordinary number of close encounter reports, especially in the United States. Throughout the late summer and fall of 1973, people across dozens of states witnessed strange lights and craft, and a surprising number of these encounters included descriptions of occupant creatures. Besides the dramatic Pascagoula event in October of that year, there were incidents like an Ohio police officer reporting an encounter with a domed disc and figures inside. Law enforcement agencies found themselves fielding call after call from concerned citizens who swore something unearthly was roaming the skies or fields at night. The mid-1970s continued this trend. By 1975 and 1976, as we've explored, some of the focus shifted to sightings around military sites and dramatic aerial encounters, such as the one over Tehran. Yet civilian life had its share of high strangeness too. In 1975, for instance, residents of a small town in Minnesota were astonished when a deputy sheriff had a late-night run-in with a glowing object that reportedly scorched the hood of his patrol car and temporarily blinded him. A case officially documented and still unexplained. Meanwhile, in South America, countries like Brazil experienced their own flurries of activity. One of the most intense and unsettling series of incidents came in 1977 in Brazil's Amazon basin. Over several months, villagers in the remote Pará region reported nightly visitations by small, luminous objects they nicknamed chupa-chupas, literally sucks, because some claimed these lights emitted beams that left puncture marks on skin and seemed to sap their energy. Panic spread as dozens of villagers described being hit by red or blue beams from low-flying UFOs, resulting in burns or illness. The situation grew so dire that the Brazilian Air Force sent a team of investigators under the code name Operação Prato, Operation Saucer, to look into it. For weeks they staked out the region, interviewing witnesses and reportedly even witnessing some of the phenomena themselves. The files from Operation Saucer, made public decades later, contain sketches of disc-shaped craft and detailed accounts of these eerie encounters. While the military eventually closed the operation without a public explanation, the Brazilian wave of 1977 stands as a chilling example of a concentrated UFO flap, with physical effects on witnesses. Elsewhere in 1977, across the Atlantic, a quieter but significant development took place in France. The French government established an official study group called GEPAN within its space agency to systematically collect and analyze UFO reports. Unlike the US, which had publicly stepped away from the topic, France decided to treat it as an area worthy of scientific inquiry, albeit a discreet one. This move was partly prompted by a series of sightings in France in the early 70s, including reports from pilots and police officers that were hard to dismiss. GEPAN's formation reflected a broader trend. By the end of the 1970s, several countries had some form of official or semi-official UFO investigation, whether publicly acknowledged or kept under wraps. In the UK, for example, the Ministry of Defence quietly continued to log sightings reported by citizens and service members, acting as a reluctant repository of data, while publicly stating it had no evidence of threat. Spain, after the high-profile Meneses case of 1979, even released a number of its Air Force files on UFO incidents, hoping a bit of transparency might quell public fascination. The global nature of the mystery was becoming harder for authorities to ignore. Popular culture in the 1970s also began to mirror and amplify the wave of sightings. Nowhere was this more evident than in film and media. In 1977, director Steven Spielberg released Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a movie that portrayed contact with otherworldly visitors in a haunting, optimistic light. The film's title was inspired by the classification system devised by Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who even made a cameo in the movie's finale. Its plot drew loosely on several real-life cases, from airliner sightings to reports of alien abductions and government secrecy. The movie was a box office hit and captured the era's mood perfectly, a time when public curiosity about UFOs had been stoked to a peak. People were scanning the night skies a little more intently, wondering if that moving light was a satellite, a plane, or perhaps something not of this Earth. During this period, UFO research organizations also flourished outside of government. In the United States, the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, grew in membership, holding annual symposiums where investigators and witnesses shared findings. Hynek, after leaving his role with the Air Force, founded the Center for UFO Studies, CUFOS, in Illinois, aiming to bring academic rigor to the civilian study of the phenomenon. Internationally, groups in Canada, the UK, Japan, and elsewhere formed networks to exchange case reports. It was a grassroots effort to solve a mystery that official institutions had largely abandoned. What these civilian sleuths lacked in resources, they made up for in passion, meticulously interviewing witnesses and poring over declassified documents for clues. By the end of the 1970s, they had compiled an impressive body of data, though a definitive answer to the UFO question remained as elusive as ever. All the while, amid the fervour, those who had direct encounters were left to make sense of their experiences. For every spectacular case that made headlines, there were hundreds of quieter ones. Farmers in Argentina who saw odd discs sweep over their ranch during the Great Flap of 1978. Families in South Africa who watched a silent light hover over a valley for minutes before zipping away. Fishermen in the Philippines who swore a glowing undersea object illuminated the water beneath their boat one night and then shot into the sky. These accounts seldom received more than local attention, yet together they formed a mosaic of testimony suggesting that whatever was happening was truly worldwide. By the close of the 1970s, belief in UFOs, or at least openness to the possibility, had entered the mainstream more than ever. Polls in various countries showed significant portions of the public thought some UFOs might be extraterrestrial or otherwise extraordinary. The subject had moved from fringe to frequent public discussion, even if often met with skepticism. Importantly, a few officials were beginning to speak more candidly as well. In 1979, the British House of Lords actually held a debate on UFOs, during which a former Chief of Defence Staff, Lord Hill Norton, pressed the government for greater transparency in light of credible reports, including an intriguing encounter at a US-run airbase in England that was just about to happen as the decade turned. Indeed, as the calendar turned to 1980, the UFO story was far from over. Early in the new decade, an extraordinary encounter at a US-operated airbase in England would show that the phenomenon could intrude even on military soil abroad. Soon after, whole regions like Belgium would find themselves under the silent gaze of mysterious triangular craft. Both superpower nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, would confront puzzling new incidents that challenged their understanding of what flew in their skies. As technology advanced with better cameras and satellites, many hoped definitive answers were finally at hand. Yet the phenomenon always seemed to stay one step ahead of our understanding. The decades to follow would bring new challenges and revelations. Episodes in the 1980s, a cautious openness in the 1990s, and eventually in the 21st century, a wave of renewed government interest and even startling admissions that would thrust UFOs into the spotlight once again. But all of that was yet to come. As the world exited the 1970s, it did so without a clear answer. but with eyes turned skyward more than ever, wondering what the next encounter might bring.